do opening statements. I can do opening statements, and then you can give your opening statements afterwards. Well, I'll just give my opening statements, right? So, Trix and Kat, are you two recording? Type or say yes, please. Gotcha. And starting now. So the debate topic between me and Arianus is going to be on the proposition of whether or not moral realism is true. I'm going to be arguing for the affirmative, and he's going to be arguing for the negation. Prior to this sort of debate, by the way, that was been planned, I guess, from last night, Arianus makes a couple of comments regarding him having an argument, which debunks moral realism and is perhaps, if not the strongest argument out there against moral realism. An argument which, I guess, given what he's saying about the argument, it gets even me hyped, So I want to hear the argument against the moral realism, which he just posted in the chat. So I'm going to run a couple of investigations into the argument, and ask him if he is using an argument which is establishing the probability of moral realism being false, or an argument which basically extrapolates towards the logical necessity of moral realism being false. That's basically the question I have for Arianus, and then from there on we can get things rolling. So let's go.
Yeah, so I'll be taking the negative in the debate, and I will be using arguments against the coherency of moral realism from the incoherency of desert realism, or just the view that there are intrinsic things in the world that sort of constitute what an agent deserves or doesn't deserve. Now, in this debate, the main outline of the argument that I provided is intended to show that there is some incoherency derived from moral realism, just given the fact that the view that desert realism is false, right, follows from that. Now, there's also a probabilistic argument that follows from this, even granting that there isn't an incoherency of moral realism sans desert realism.
Okay, cool. So it's a probabilistic argument. Okay, so before I even delve into the things or the factors which makes your conclusion more likely than the moral realist conclusion, right? Before you even delve into that, okay, I want a couple of clarifications on these two terminologies. So what are the conditions or the semantical criteria that you're utilizing in this debate to establish whether or not a given position upholds some level of coherency or does not uphold any level of coherency, thus rendering it to be incoherent?
Yeah, so the semantic criteria is going to be embedded on whether or not it's consistent with A, like classical logical rules, right? And B, that it is consistent with our linguistic practices or just like our conventional usages of terms, right? Especially when we talk about things like, whether or not an agent deserves something, we're going to have to like attribute some sort of like normativity or some like sense of like deontic norms into that. So I'm basically just saying the semantic consistency is embedded into those linguistic practices.
Okay, so what you just referenced when you're defining or clarifying the concept of coherency was a disjunction, not a conjunction. And so if it satisfies one of the disjuncts, then it would be the case that moral realism is coherent, correct?
Yeah, if it happens to be that it satisfies at least one of those, then it would be, yeah, coherent.
Okay, so do you believe there's a logical contradiction entailed from the proposition that the moral realism is true?
Yes.
Okay, so moral realism is true. You think there's a contradiction entailed from this? Okay, cool. So what do you think the contradiction would be? What do you think the P and not P would be, which would be entailed from that proposition? Start off with proposition 1 or proposition A, and then give me the proposition not A, which you think is simultaneously entailed from moral realism being true.
Okay. I'm gonna like give the rundown of the arguments, right? That's in the chat. And you can tell me like which like premise you can test within that, and then I'll motivate the premise. Is that cool?
I'll do that in a second. I just want to hear the proposition A and not A first, because you believe that for it to be coherent, it has to satisfy at least one of the disjuncts. The two disjuncts you have laid out on the table this far is it being consistent with classical logic, or if it is consistent with conventional linguistic practices. Like, for example, given like the concept of normativity, if that is consistent with these conventional linguistic practices, then it would be the case that it would be sufficiently justified for you to make the claim that moral realism as a concept is coherent. Now, I'm specifically investigating and assessing and evaluating whether or not you believe it to be the case that it does not satisfy the first disjunct, which brings you to having the burden that you have currently, which is showing the logical contradiction. So we can talk about the arguments you have for why moralism is false later on. I'm just curious about the proposition about whether or not it is incoherent, which entails that it is not consistent with classical logic, which you have yet to demonstrate this far.
Yeah, so I'll take the proposition to be there is a normative moral fact about X, and that normative fact is grounded in the fact that X deserves something, and there is not a normative moral fact about X, that normative fact is grounded in the fact that X deserves something.
Okay, when you say deserve something, what does the word deserve mean there? Because I'm not sure if that is baked into my concept of normativity.
It's something like it's merited or warranted for this person to take this course of action, right? So think of like charity being something that people typically we want to attribute like old people deserve, just
Mhm.
given the fact that it's like an honorific or some sort of like uh, display of respect, just given the fact that we hold elders to high regard and things like that. So it's like attributing some sense of like normative merit or like reward to like an agent's actions, right? In this
So normative
context.
merits, by normative merits, you're just talking about what sort of merits, like action guidance type merits, something like that?
Yes.
Okay, so action guidance can be something which is interpreted in a motivational sense, right? So you can have actions which, when you're talking about action guidance concepts, you're not necessarily talking about normativity in the sense of ethics, but normativity in the sense of epistemology, like what one ought to believe, for example. So, what would be the sufficient distinction between epistemic normativity and ethical normativity, which would clarify the concept further for everyone, including me, to even understand what you're arguing currently?
Oh yeah. So when it comes to like epistemic normativity, we're talking about the conditions of justification given like an agent's beliefs, right? So when we say like X is warranted in believing in Y, we're saying just given the conditions of their epistemology, right? It would be epistemically rewarding if they believed in this, right? So if someone has justification for their beliefs, right, and they're well justified, we will say, you know, it's deserving, it's epistemically meritorious that they hold to that belief. When it comes to moral norms, we're talking about actions, right? Strictly, not beliefs. So we're like attributing that concept of reward and merits to like the actions that they undertake to like perform something in the world.
Okay, so do you believe, I'm not sure if you've heard this in conventional linguistic practices, as you like to call it, but I'm pretty certain you'd hear people say something like, you should believe this, or you should not believe this guy, right? Like, you'd hear people say these, like, sentences in daily conversations, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, do you think when they're making that claim, they're saying that you would commit an immoral action if you're to believe that person?
If I were to believe that person,
Yeah, so if when someone says, when Agent A says to Agent B, for example,
yeah,
hey,
they're
you
like
should not believe this
invoking,
guy.
yeah, they're invoking some like reason givingness standard, right? About like what would
But I'm asking you, do
constitute
you
a
believe this
justified
reason
belief.
given standard is something which is ethically related?
Not strictly ethically related, no. Like
Okay,
on the
so I
face
agree with
of
you on
it,
this.
on the
I
face
don't
of
even
it,
think it
there.
is ethically related. I agree with you on this, but I would say that in that case scenario, I think that when they're saying you should not believe this person, they're saying given the actual facts, which would be relevant to knowledge, it
Sure.
would not be epistemically meritorious, as I like to call it, I should say, for you to believe that person. And so, what I would say is that that specifically demonstrates some level of distinction between epistemic normativity and moral normativity. However, in that case scenario, I don't think they're trying to like say. I don't think epistemic normativity is just merely talking about the conditions for justification, but rather it's talking about what one would believe considering the current justificatory status quo of a given belief, which is different.
Okay, so two things here. Number one, when I'm like specifically talking about justification, I'm like embedding those reason giving norms into the concept of like what would make like a view or let's say like a particular belief in this context like epistemically meritorious. So if you have like a descriptivist account of justification, that's fine. But I'm just laying out the concept of normativity, which I take to be just given the folk semantics as to what people mean when they say, oh, I'm justified in holding to the belief, right? Like Apollo, you would say you're justified in believing that you're the best debater ever, right? And we would say, okay, given the evidence, right, Apollo is either undeserving or deserving of having that belief, just given like what the current like conditions are to evaluate that claim.
Okay, so I think there's this nuanced and very subtle discrepancy, or the, I guess, difference between being justified in believing something. Sorry about the background noise. Being justified in believing something, and also saying that like it is the case that someone is not deserving of believing said thing, right? And for example, you could actually believe that someone is justified in believing X, and still not hold to the belief that should not believe not X, right? And so if that is to be the case, which I think is very plausible, right? Like you're not, for example, forcing one to believe a particular belief. Just like, for example, I've talked to an atheist recently, and he was saying that, like, yeah, I think atheism is true. I think theism is definitely false. You can be a Christian and whatever. Just don't enforce those beliefs onto me, and that won't enforce my beliefs onto you. And I think that one conversation I had with that person is reflective of what I'm talking about currently, supportive of what I'm talking about currently. Insofar as someone can believe that, hey, your position is false, but you're entitled to believe in it. There's nothing wrong with you believing it, and I'm not going to say that you should not believe in it, but just don't enforce that onto me. Okay?
Okay. So they're making a prescription as of like what's following from like that given epistemic disagreement, right? The normative claim in the latter being, okay, you shouldn't impose your beliefs onto me. The former is having to do with the concept of justification, right? I take the concept of justification to be grounded specifically within like norms of epistemic reason givingness, right? So when I say I'm justified in believing in X, right? I'm going to have to evaluate, given my concept and given like how I construe my epistemic scheme, what are the conditions for my belief, right? And whether or not that belief corresponds to reality. And if that belief corresponds to reality and all those other conditions are met, right, within that confounding concept, then I'm justified. I'm warranted in holding to that belief, right? So I should hold to that
I
belief,
get what you're
just
saying here,
given like
but
my own criteria.
The first time when you gave the sort of definition for epistemic normativity, all you mentioned in that definition or that sort of analysis or evaluation was you just merely talking about conditions for justification which warrants a belief effect. And so that's saying there's that means not meet discussions, and one is still not committed to any sort of epistemically normative claim insofar as, okay, you have belief X, which does not meet conditions for justification, but nonetheless, it is not correct to say that one should not believe in belief X, right?
Okay. And here's the thing, the conditions of justification are going to be rules, right? So what do you think normativity is, right? If I'm out of accord with the rules of justification or that which constitutes justification, just given the concept of justification I'm deploying in this conversation, you would say, yeah, that would be an example of like Arianus acting irrationally because he's out of line, he's not in accord with like his rule set of justification, right? So I just take that to be normative. If you have like another understanding of normativity, just tell me what it is. But
Sorry, could you repeat
nothing
what you
you've
take to
said
be
this
normative,
far,
please?
nothing
Because
you
you're making
said
some
this
background
far,
noise.
nothing
Repeat
you
it.
said this
Mhm.
far is like inconsistent with the set of standards that I provided for that concept.
So you take normativity to be the relevant justification which guides actions. Is that what you're saying?
The relevant conditions which are rule guiding for justification as it pertains to like epistemic justification.
And by rule guiding, you mean in that case? Like what's the rule
Like
given this
there's like
analysis
certain
here?
constraints, yeah, there's certain like constraints as to like how I should perform like certain normative standards, like whether or not, like take for example the quaddition versus additions example and like the Kripkean semantic argument, right? Like if I'm in accord with one operand rather than another, that's going to be attributed to some sort of like rule following, right? And there's normative
Okay. So
facts pertaining to whether or not like my interpretation of that rule is consistent or inconsistent with like the deviant operant rule.
So when you're talking about constraints, are these constraints kind of like laws, for example, like metaphysical laws, like, you know, you could perhaps even consider the laws of physics as a subset of the laws. So with these constraints are like the laws of physics, or are they
No,
something distinct from the laws of physics insofar as they don't have causal power? What are you saying that?
I think they're hyper intentionally grounded by the concept.
And by hyper-intentionally grounded by the concept, what's your analysis of hyper-intentionally grounded in this?
Oh, so there's going to be strict conditions as to whether or not some concept is going to map onto like latter concepts, right? So you have a concept of, let's say, beauty, right? And let's just define beauty as like the set of conditions which constitute like good facial symmetry, right? Good nose to lip ratio, like I don't know, a positive canthal tilt. I mean, you know all the PSL lingo, so I don't need to like get into that, right? I have these
Okay.
like constituent conditions down in the concept. And then I look at the world, I look at entities in the world, and then I try to like make evaluations and assessments as to what fits that concept, right? So the hyper intentional part is a sort of asymmetric relation where I'm drawing irreflexively which facts in the world or which states in the
Maps
world
onto the conditions of the
constitute
concept.
beauty and map out that concept exactly.
Yeah. So, okay, so I understand what you're saying better now. So now let's just see. So you think for some reason that it is the case that when you're talking about conditions of justification, you're specifically invoking normativity in that concept of justification. Do you
Hmm.
think all accounts, do you think action guided justification or all types of action guided justification are the types of justification which invokes rule guided conceptual conditions?
Yeah, because it's hyper intentionally necessary, right? It would have to follow just if the concept of A maps necessarily to the concept of B, right? Then like asymmetrically, it can't be the case that those things are going to be grounded in one another. It can't be the case like A grounds B and then B grounds A, right? It has to be the case that necessarily A would have to ground B and not vice versa, right? Just given like the law of
Okay,
irreflexibility.
you
Yeah.
believe that it is the case that motivational justification is normative, right?
Motivational justification is normative, yes.
So if I'm motivated, if I have some sort of reason which motivates me to do an action, you would say that it is the case I should do this action?
Well, just given like what your norms are, so I'm going to have to reduce norms to like hypothetical descriptions, and that's like my current view. So I even take things like I'm motivated to drink water to be consistent with like I ought to drink water, just given like what my desires are, or like what my intentional prescriptions are.
Wait, sorry again, but could you repeat the sentence, please? A lot of background
Yeah.
noise on
So
my apologies.
motivational justification under my concept is going to be developed off of hypothetical norms or like descriptions as to like what an agent desires or doesn't desire. And given that rule set,
Okay, got
I
you.
can determine assessments as
Hmm.
to whether or not I should do this thing given
Do
my
you think this
motivation.
kind of justification? Do you think this kind of justification is consistent with conventional linguistic practices? Like, do you think like the average person would say something like, "Hey, if this psychopathic perpetrator, like let's say Jeffrey Dahmer, was motivated to like assassinate or kill these means he ought to do it or he should have done it." Like, do you think that that's the general notion of like you could say normativity?
Well, yeah, because I'm going to have to like posit like intersubjective facts as to like what people generally desire, right? So like there's a separation between hypothetical norms relating to an agent and just like the given conventional practices. You invoked conventional practices after I invoked the term conventional practices. Conventional practices isn't just like what Jeffrey Dahmer believes, right, is like motivating to him. It's also like a community of people that have like commensurate values, right? And most people would say, yes, his values are going to contradict the conventional understanding as to what would be like morally
I think
justified
you're
in
kind of
that
missing the
context.
point. When you're talking about conditions of a view being coherent, you mentioned the particular idea of you being consistent, given the information that we're presented with about the view itself, that you being conventional linguistic practices. Okay, so I'm
Yeah.
saying that given the conventional linguistic practices that are being employed by linguistic agents, when you're talking about what we ought to do and what we ought not to do, or what we should do, or what we should not do you think it is the case that such conceptual analysis of justification in the normative sense is consistent with your view, in which you think motivational justification is sufficient for there to be some sort of
I
normativity?
already explained why it's consistent. It's conventionally ingrained, right? Your sort of like assumptions seem to like rely on this like presupposition that there's some like external there's like some sort of like external normativity that's like grounding how people use these terms and like how they determine whether or not Jeffrey Dahmer is immoral for like having these desires and like acting out on those desires.
That's not an assumption I'm making. I'm asking you a question regarding whether or not you believe that they would hold the position that motivational justification is sufficient for there to be normative. Whether or not they hold to this position is relevant to what they believe the moral
Yes.
facts are. I'm
Yes.
just asking you this question to see if. Hold on, I'm still
Yes,
talking.
it would
I'm
be.
asking you this
Yes.
question to see if you're doing the purism thing, where you think talking over the person is actually good rhetoric.
No,
So
it's
what I'm
not
saying
pure
here is simply
autism.
that
You're the one that's autistic. I
it's
just
kind of pure
replied yes
autism
to
when
your
someone
question
is
so we can
actually
save
talking
time.
and you're talking over the person because you're getting intimidated. Look,
Oh,
just
yeah,
calm
so we
down. You
can
have a panic
save
attack for no
time,
reason.
right? I said
So
yes
can I
to
finish
your
talk?
question.
Okay, so you understand that it was not a yes or no question. So you saying yes is idiotic. But then
How is
to
it idiotic?
continue my
You
point
asked
before there
me
were interruptions,
specifically, do
it's
you think
idiotic.
these
It's
people
idiotic
would
to
think that
respond to a
motivational
question which is not.
justification is
You
like
asked me a
sufficient to like
question which is
ground
how is it
these like
idiotic, and let me
linguistic
explain it to you.
practices? And I said
Yeah,
yes.
maybe. Yeah, you can finish your sentence when I'm done talking. Okay. What I'm saying here is simply that the reason why this is idiotic is asking a yes or no question. Okay, that's number one. So you interrupted a non yes or no question by saying yes, but maybe
Okay,
if
so
you
you're
listened to the
contradicting
entirety of the
yourself
question,
because like the
you'd have
whole purpose of
understood
like
that it
you
was not
presenting
a
that
yes or
was
no
a yes or
question.
no question.
That's not the look. I don't
Yes,
know why you're using the word
yes.
cannibal.
If you ask,
That's not even contradiction.
do you think that motivational justification, right, would
That's
be
the question which
sufficient
came
as a
before the
way of
last
talking about
question.
these things, right?
That was
And
not the
I
most
said
recent question.
yes, right, as a response to that. I'm affirming that, right?
Look, I don't know if
Why would you
you're
then
going through
say
a
it's
lagging
not a
moment.
yes or no question?
Look, I don't know if you're bringing a lagging moment,
Look,
but my
I don't
most
know like
recent
why you're
question was not that
interrupting me.
question.
I don't know like if there's a moderator in the
I'm
room.
interrupting
I
your
just want to
interruption.
get
Yeah,
to like the
I'm interrupting your
substance of the
interruption.
argument. I just
See,
want to
that's how
get
it
to
goes.
like the
Yeah, it's
substance
called
of the
reciprocation.
arguments.
I'm
I don't know why you're
interrupting
like
your
spazzing out
interruption.
right now.
I was talking first. You're saying someone is passing out as you were aping out. That's
You're
actually so
spazzing out.
hard.
Yes,
Again,
I
I'm gonna
literally
do this
met your
though. I'm gonna do
conditions. I
this though.
said
I'm gonna go off the
yes.
meta because I know your survival instincts are giving you the signal to interrupt me because you don't get
What's
those points,
survival
right? I'm
instincts,
gonna go
bro?
back to
It's
the
like
substantive
literally a
point.
debate. Just
I'm
get
gonna
to the
go back to the
substance.
substantive point. Okay.
Can we talk about my
I'm
argument
trying
or
to,
no?
but you're meta
You're the one
debating
that's
on
literally
interruptions. You're
evading
meta
it by
debating
not
on
talking about
autism.
my argument for some reason.
I'm talking about your argument a while ago until you
No, you're
interrupted me to
not.
go off.
You haven't even seen the. Have you seen the document? Yes or no?
So are you going to actually allow me to finish my point?
Go ahead.
Okay, here's if it is the case that your kind of justification in the normative sense is not the way in which people would actually use this or employ this notion, given how they conventionally apply language to extrapolate or rather to a concept, then given the count of coherency, your normativity would be incoherent. Now, you saying, well, probably you're assuming that they have this sort of. I'm not assuming anything. I was asking you a question regarding whether or not you believe that this is consistent. You said yes, but then you gave a trash justification afterwards, something which is really fragile. You said afterwards that, again, you thought the justification for it being something which is conventionally applied would still uphold despite the fact that most people without the intuitions to believe that Jeffrey Dahmer or the vast majority of society being motivated to assassinate people would not be sufficient for us to make a claim about that specific state of affairs. Do you think those two things are
Yeah, that's an
consistent? Right.
assumption.
But
Yeah,
again,
I just
I'm gonna
said.
give you
Yeah,
I'm gonna give you
and
a
I
chance. I'm
responded to
gonna give
that.
you a
Yeah, and I
chance. I'm still
responded to
talking.
that.
I'm still talking. See the interruption thing again.
Okay, so
But
you're gonna
I'm gonna give you
blather
a
on.
chance.
Okay, just
I'm going to
continue
give
then.
you a chance to redeem yourself from the blunder you made a while ago. So give another
There is no
response, and let's
blunder.
see if this
There is no
is going to be
blunder.
something which is not
Look,
nonsensical
if
this time.
normativity, look, retard. If normativity is like constrained specifically by the intersubjective standards of a community, then yes, most people are going to say, even if Jeffrey Dahmer has like those desires and motivations personally, we're still going to vastly disagree with him. We're going to vehemently disagree with him because it doesn't coincide, it's not commensurate with the conventional practices of the community, right? What was the condition I gave you at the beginning? I said this would have to be coherent if it's in line with the semantic standards of a linguistic community. Most people having the intuition that Jeffrey Dahmer's motivations are immoral, just given the fact that he wants to kill people for fun, right, is consistent with my claim where I'm specifically mentioning that within an intersubjective context, right? What you're trying to bring in is, okay, they have this intuition that he shouldn't do that, irrespective of what his motivations are. And then I said, yes, that's going to assume, it's going to like presume like some sort of like externalism there. So can you respond to that? Like, how is it the case that most people having the intuition that he shouldn't do this thing irrespective of his motivations, how can't I explain that under like some conventionalist thesis
Okay,
of like
so these are the
motivational
type of non
justification?
sequiturs you would make if you're a tier 4 debater,
It's
right?
not a
Because
non
you
sequitur.
actually
Okay,
got the
show
last
me like
question.
where
See,
there is like a lack
five
of like
seconds into my
rational
point
inference
in
there.
response, and you're already aping out. Wow, the insecurities are popping off. So
No,
what
I'm
I'm
just
saying
like
here is that
I'm trying to like
you're,
save
yeah, you
time
can
here. So
ask me
like,
the
please
dumb
tell me
question
what
you
the
have
non
to ask me
sequitur is.
after I'm done talking. You can ask me the inept question you have for me when I'm done talking. Okay. What I
How
was
is
gonna
it
say though
inept?
is that I'm gonna just address the substance, the meat of potatoes. Okay. Now the most recent questions that I've asked you had another disjunct which you've not addressed. I ask you if it is the case that most people would believe that under the condition where Jeffrey Dahmer, if not the majority, so it was both disjuncts, it was either Jeffrey Dahmer solely is motivated to do the actions, or both Jeffrey Dahmer and the majority would be motivated in alignment with that action, would that action now become something which we ought to do, or which there's no issue with doing? So you addressed the first disjunction saying, hey, Jeffrey Dahmer alone being motivated to do the action would not be sufficient considering that there is this sort of intersubjective generated normativity type concept which is generated by the society which disagrees with his motivation would not sufficiently answer my question. Because the latter half of my question, which you would have heard if you're not aping the fuck out and interrupting, also invokes the majority of people being motivated to doing the action or being motivated in such a way where they do not have any sort of polemic in towards the action. Right. So again, now I want to log the fuck onto the last disjunct, stop aping out, stop interrupting, log the fuck in. Do you think under the second disjunct, whereas the vast majority of people were motivated towards killing people, the average ethical agent would say now that it is okay to do the action, or rather, it's a normative fact to do the specific action? Yes or no?
It wouldn't be consistent with like conventional norms, so they would say no. But just given like Jeffrey Dahmer's concept, right, of like morality, he would be justified. I don't see like how is that inconsistent with like the criteria that I gave. Look,
So you're saying, given his account of
his
justification?
desires, his motivations are inconsistent with like the linguistic and moral practices of like his day, right? But he's nevertheless justified given his own concept of morality, right? I
Wait,
just
so
don't
the
happen
answer
to
to my
share
question a
his
while ago was
concept
no,
or his
correct?
motivations. How can I
Wait,
not
so the
explain
answer to
that
my
under
question,
some
just
like
to make sure I heard you
conventionalist thesis
properly,
of motivational justification?
just to make sure I heard you properly, the answer to my most recent question was a no, correct?
Yes.
Okay, now if it is a no, insofar as it is the case that the average ethical agent would not have the intuition that this action is a justified action, irrespective of the preponderance of motivations, then your whole position gets debunked
No,
in some
that's
sense.
false.
Because you believe, yeah,
Okay,
I'll
look,
explain to
they
you why that's
have the
correct before you give
intuition.
the
Look,
dumb
they have the
reason as to
intuition that
why you
he's
think it is
wrong in
false.
what he's
See,
doing,
look,
and then
buddy, let's
look,
not be autistic,
because you're
okay?
not
Let's do this
understanding. Look, the
without starting to
intuition,
finish. You're
if they have the
understanding the
intuition that
contradiction
he's
here,
doing
and that's why
something
you're
wrong,
aping the fuck out.
it's
So I'm
conventionally
gonna try to finish
grounded in
my
like what the
sentence. I'm
practices
gonna
are
try
of
to
the
finish
given
my
day.
sentence and address the point you're so scared for me to address right now. Okay? So
No,
you're
because
saying,
you
because
like
you
keep
mentioned
jumping
previously, you
into like
believe that
weird
your account,
conclusions, right?
Arianus, stop aping out. Okay? So what I'm trying to help you out with here is your dumb concept, and you're not even giving me the opportunity to educate you why it is retarded. Okay, now I'm telling you that if
Educate
you
you.
believe, which you do believe, that normative justification is something which is coherent given your concept. If you believe that, which you do believe, by the way, then clearly it is the case it satisfies one of the two disjuncts you specified previously regarding either something being consistent with classical logic or something being consistent with linguistic conventional practices. Okay, I established, given the hypotheticals I've just given a while ago, that it would not be consistent with conventional linguistic practices because you believe it to be the case that people would not have these sort of linguistic, ethical, and semantical intuitions about someone being justified in an action, even if we were to stipulate the condition where the vast majority of people, if not one person, is motivated towards assassinating a group of people or genociding a
Okay,
group of people.
so
So
look,
clearly,
genius.
hold
Okay,
on a
hold on.
second,
Okay,
Ariane. I'm not
fine.
done
Yeah.
talking, buddy. Just relax for a second. You're having a panic attack. So the last part of what I was going to say, by the way, before the rude interruption again from Arianus. Now, I was just going to mention that if that is to be the case, that fact to which you have agreed they would not have the intuition to adopt regarding that proposition is more expected under it not being consistent with conventional linguistic practices. So it's more evidence against your whole concept being something which is coherent. It's not coherent given your own account of coherency. You can talk now.
Yeah, so that was just like a retarded bouquet of flowers. So look, first of all, the concept is going to be contained within like the conventional standards of the community. Most people having the intuition that Jeffrey Dahmer is immoral because he wants to kill people for fun and that's just like what his motivations are doesn't contradict, nor does it make it less likely that the conventionalist account that I gave is true, right? You have yet to justify that, right? The whole point is if it's an intuition that most people have that Jeffrey Dahmer is immoral because he just has like a different rule set or like a different value set from most people, right? It doesn't follow from that that just given the semantics of the term moral there, that's in conflict with like the specific criteria that was established before, right? The whole point is I have a concept of morality. That concept of morality is inconsistent with what Jeffrey Dahmer is proposing, right? I have an adjudication that his like actions are wrong, just given the fact that I'm a participant in the moral community, right? That I share most people's values, right? So tell me how I'm not justified in saying, just given like my account of coherency, that he is not motivationally justified, right? Just given those intersubjective standards. That's one. And then number two, you said something completely ridiculous like, okay, just given the fact that this concept isn't going to be consistent with the criteria that you gave, it must be the fact that it's not like justified or it's like irrational or there's like some portion within your concept that just breaks down. That's false, right? There's a specific internalist criteria that I provided that specifically talks about the morality of an action just contingent upon the values of a given community. Now, what you said was most people would have the intuition that given the fact that he has these desires and that these motivations seem to be immoral, it just shows that your conventionalist thesis is false. You have yet to justify that because there is no bar or there is nothing preventing me from making those adjudications within my own system, right? Within the own conventional system that I provided to you or the moral system. So tell me how most people having the intuition that what he's doing is wrong, irrespective of his motivations, would justify your claim that my conventional thesis of these like moral semantics is false. Yo,
Hey, what's up? Let me know if I'm bugging out. I think I might be bugging out. Am I bugging out?
no, you're not now,
Okay,
but it's like for me, it's like cutting out.
okay, got you.
Are you like
Okay, it
outside?
might be my Wi-Fi. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm outside now. You were talking to me when you were texting me when I was outside, but just to address a couple of things. I said that something not meeting your criteria of coherency makes it the case that it is not justified or it is not rational. I said it not meeting your criteria of coherency makes it incoherent by definition. Now, I'll just give you like a pretty simple example, which exemplifies my point better for you to understand. So, if you believe, for example, that most people use the word bachelor in a way where someone is unmarried, okay, like an unmarried man would be sufficient for someone to be a bachelor. If you think that's most people's definition, given the conventional linguistic practices, then it would be expected that if you were to stipulate, like let's say the president of France, for example, to not be married, if you were to stipulate that and ask the average person, hey, do you think if the president of France was to not be married, would he be a bachelor? It would be expected, irrespective of whether or not it is an actual fact of the matter, that the average person would say yes if they're to be acquainted with the relevant linguistic epistemic facts about the word bachelor. Now, we don't see this in the case of ethics, whereas you talk about justification in the normative sense. We don't believe, or rather, we don't see this sort of like expectation insofar as if you ask the average person, if the vast majority of people, if not Jeffrey Dahmer solely, whichever one it is, if the vast majority of people are Jeffrey Dahmer to be motivated into genocide in a group of people, would it be the case that that person is justified, right? The average person would say no, they would not believe this. So that, for one, demonstrates a high probability of them not believing there's some sort of synonymy, whether semantically or linguistically, between, let's say, the word the word normativity, I should say, and the concept of mere motivation, especially for normativity, right? That's what they are. So strong amendment a couple of things regarding me making the claim that it is not justified or not rational, given your coherence. So I was not making any claim about justification or rationality. I was merely making the claim about your kinds of coherency to make it or
Coherency.
launch an internal polemic.
Okay, can I respond
Yeah,
now? Yeah,
so
so like
can you respond?
when you make the point about like the president of France being a bachelor because he's an unmarried man and most people agreeing, right, with like the synonymy and how the terms are being used. Yes, they would understand that within the domain within their concept of bachelor, which is vastly more transparent than like any sort of moral concepts which people have like wide incommensurability in regards to, would have to agree on, right? The whole point is that these moral concepts, right, are going to be like more opaque to like a given epistemic status of each agent, right? So the fact that like most people agree with this moral concept, it doesn't bar, just given like my view, that there couldn't be some person, let's say called Jeffrey Dahmer, which doesn't have epistemic access to like the intersubjective moral concepts of that day, or maybe they do, but their like access to them are just like vastly opaque, right? So like when you sort of like invoke this like sort of symmetry, or this supposed symmetry, I should say, because that's your attempt in saying, okay, there is like a bachelor, he's an unmarried man, most people would understand that as being synonymous, and then you have this case in the moral domain, right, where it seems like it wouldn't track just like these intersubjective features to say that he would be justified. That's just assuming that like the concepts in the domain of morality are like acquitative, or like say equal to the domain of like whether or not there are like bachelors and they're like identical to like unmarried men. I don't grant that even if it's the case that these like concepts are like grounded by intersubjective standards, that like most people would have like some sort of like strong intuitive basis to say, okay, Jeffrey Dahmer is like definitively or like actually unjustified, right? Just given like the differences in like conceptual transparency there, right? So you haven't addressed that. And then there's like some sort of issue where even if it's the case that there's some sort of incommensurability upon like how people use these concepts, it still doesn't mean that like my usage of like the term moral is like incoherent. I'm still directly referring to his concept of morality as just being like wrong, or it's like false, just given like the conventional semantics, right? So if he has the motivation to harm most people, and I have the motivation alongside most people that he shouldn't do that, then he would by all means be unjustified in doing so, right? But that doesn't exclude the fact that there could be like outliers, right? There's people that have conflicting motivations all the time. I don't see how this shows that like my view of like these semantics is incoherent.
Yeah, so yeah, you did like a question back when you said that like his concept of morality would be wrong under the condition where you, as well as the vast majority of
No.
people, do not share his motivations. That begs the question, because the thing we're questioning here is whether or not wrongness in that specific moral sentence is indexed to motivations, which you've yet to actually demonstrate. But before you
Wait,
even address
sorry.
that, you also have to
Okay,
demonstrate
okay.
I'm still talking. You would also have to prove the claim that there's a difference in conceptual transparency between, you could say, facts about justification, or what justification means, and the concept of normativity, and let's say what the bachelor is. That's something to be proven, to be proved by the way, that's a claim you made. And lastly, or maybe not lastly, but this is going to be one of the last points, it appears to be the case that the primary motivations, pun intended by the way, behind your reason for saying that this would not be good evidence against the idea of your position being coherent, is based off the fact that one of these concepts are opaque and the other one is non-opaque. So I'm going to ask you this yes or no question, which is, if you believe that most concepts or most things used in normal conversations are non-opaque, or are they opaque?
In most contexts,
You can answer that question first and then address the other points. Yeah. In most conversations, whereas we have linguistic agents using words, right? Using like specific words in conversations. Do you think the vast majority of these concepts are opaque? Or do you believe the vast majority of these concepts are non-opaque?
well, it depends on like what particular context it is. In the moral case, it's going to be opaque.
Across all the
In the
concepts, do you believe
mathematical case, in the
the vast majority
mathematical
of
case,
concepts?
it will be like transparent. It depends like what domain you're
Okay.
like speaking from.
Okay, so let's just talk about domains. By the way, I'm not talking about, like, for example, and I'm pretty sure I'm not confusing transparency insofar as the empirical access to the facts are concerned. They're just talking about transparency as it relates to the conceptual facts, okay? So I'm asking you, just in normal conversations, even outside of mathematical concepts, do you believe that at least the vast majority of concepts that normal people use are transparent? Yes or no?
Just in everyday parlance, in everyday language.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, but that's not true of the moral domain.
You understand that your view now, we have an inductive case against your claim, right? We have an inductive case and inductive evidence against the claim that it would be the case that in the moral domain it is non-transparent. And so for it to posit exceptions without any sufficient justification which outweighs the inductive probabilistic
Okay, can I
argument,
respond
your
to
view becomes
this?
less parsimonious.
No, it's
Of
not less
course, you go for it.
parsimonious. How is it less parsimonious? Like, what sort of like ontic types am I introducing by saying like the majority of like moral discourse is going to be non-transparent?
I'm not going to, but
Are you talking about
idea.
theoretic types? Okay, what new theoretic types? Okay, what new theoretic types are being
You're
posited
postulating an
within the
independent
data?
proposition.
There's an
You're
independent
postulating an
proposition.
independent proposition. Yeah. We have a
No, there
general
isn't
claim, we
an
have a general
exception.
fact, which is
There isn't an
simply,
exception, right?
yes, there is. You're
Given
saying
like how most
here's the
people
fact,
use
right?
the terms, given
Let
how most
me
people use the
educate you on
terms,
the exceptions,
given
right?
how
So
most people
if
use
you
the
say,
terms, there
buddy,
wouldn't be a new theoretic type.
you're spazzing out.
Given how
I'm going to
most
explain
people
to you as to
use
why
the
there would be an
terms, there
exception.
wouldn't be a new
If we
theoretic type.
have,
No, because you're just strawmanning the
I'm
position.
going to
Like
let you
I don't know.
finish
Do you
aping
just
out,
want
and
me
then
to
I'm going to
like
respond
shut up
afterwards. Okay?
every time you say something that's like
Yeah, I was
false?
talking first, but you're just like spazzing out for some reason.
Yeah, because I'm trying to clarify the position, right? So let me just deal with like these points one by one. So you said first,
What
my
clarification is even
position
needed
is
at
going to
this?
be question begging, right? Just given the fact that I'm like making an assessment that his concept is going to be wrong, right? But like the concept, it can't be the case that the necessary and sufficient conditions for like a concept obtaining or like question begging. I just take question begging to be like an attribute applied to like arguments, right? So like if there's going to be, let's say, an argument and you give like sort of a non-amplitive reasoning or like let's say like non-independent justification for like the plausibility of a conclusion, that would be question begging, right? If you assume the conclusion within your argument but you don't motivate it. I was just telling you what the necessary and
Yeah,
sufficient
motivated
conditions
the
are of
conclusion.
the concept. So it
Yeah,
can't
so
be the case that I'm like
here's the
telling you
problem.
if a bachelor is defined as an unmarried man, that's
Uh-huh.
going to be begging the question, right? I'm just giving you like what the sufficient and necessary conditions are for the conjoined of like a bachelor and an unmarried man, right? So that was an amateur mistake on your part, right? Attributing question begging, right, to like the properties of concepts. And then the second part that I laid out was just specifically targeting like this insane view that you have, by the way, where like if there is like vast, let's say, phenomenal or epistemic opacity to moral concepts, it has to be the case that I'm like theoretically inflating my model. That's not true, right? There's been no evidence provided by you that I'm introducing like complex laws and like attempting to explain why the vast majority of moral concepts would be opaque, right? I'm just giving a thesis as to like what the given parlance is and what I observe, right? Given the moral disagreements of the day. That doesn't mean that it's like vastly incommensurate with like theoretical simplicity or like epistemic simplicity.
Yeah, so that was just a whole bunch of non-nutritional word salad. Talk about amateur mistakes when this is just a performance I'd expect from a tier 4 amateur. When you talk about the idea of me not given the sort of motivation or justification for why you would be theoretically inflating your position, right? I actually gave the justification. I explained to you what it was, but again, you did the thing where you're autistically interrupting my evidence, right? Or the evidential demonstration, Michael. Now, for you to say that you're not isolated an exception is ridiculous. It's preposterous. You know why? Because guess what? You agree on something being generally true, and then you believe that, hey, even though it is generally true for concepts, that they are transparent.
You cut out.
You agreed with. So
Apollo, you
for you to
cut
say,
out for
oh,
me.
I'm not giving any,
Apollo,
still talking.
Apollo.
I'm still talking. Look at you, you're so scared, man.
No,
So
yeah, I'm
anyways, I'm just
saying
gonna
you
continue
cut
my
out
point.
for me. There's a
Yeah, I
part that
don't
was
care about
cut out.
what you're gonna say when I'm done talking, okay? I'm trying to
Yo,
say
bro,
now.
I'm telling you,
I'm
I
cutting out
didn't
right now.
hear like most of that because you cut out, bro.
Okay, so I'm still bugging out.
You cut out for like a minute or so.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just restart my Discord and then come back, okay? Yo, I'm back. Okay, so I'm back. Cool.
Yo.
So can you hear me? Bugging out.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. So which part did I leave off on? Was it the exceptions part? I'll just repeat everything. That's fine. You said that an exception you're postulating, which would theoretically inflate the complexity of your position, which is not even the case. If you agree on a generalization, if you agree that generally speaking, right, it is the case that concepts are being employed linguistically, conversations are concepts, they're systemically, okay, then for you to say that related to justification or ethics is not a part of this generalization, you'd have to posit by definition an exception to the general trend. It's an exception by definition. An exception is just any sort of like specific incident or event or case scenario which goes against what is generally true or goes against an established or pre-established trend. What you did was give a case scenario which you believe to be an exception. So for you to say it's not an exception is again ridiculous or insane, as you like to put it. But to go on to the other part of what you're talking about, okay, so you referenced that you are not question begging when you're making the claim that Jeffrey Dahmer, okay, is the type of person who would have wrong or would have an incorrect concept of morality given the preponderance of motivations going against his motivation to do a given action. And what I'm saying to you here is that, hey, irrespective, are you making this claim would be a question begging. Insofar as the specific deduction you're making or drawing based off the hypothetical case scenario both evaluating together hinges on the assumption that what determines the ethical facts of the matter is something which is dependent on these intersubjective norms, which is predicated on a preponderance of motivations. So when I say question, again, I'm not talking about a formalized version of the argument where the premise explicitly restates or presupposes the conclusion. I am saying that it's given responsive, given particular hypothetical or argument or thing in question or contention, hinges on something which has been placed into question from the very beginning, which you've yet to sufficiently justify. Now, last but not least, you referenced something about laws when talking about exceptions and so forth and parsimony. I don't see how that's necessarily even relevant to what I was talking about. And I never said it has to be the case that, given your perspective of conceptual transparency, or rather what is conceptually transparent in this case and what is not conceptually transparent, your view would be less parsimonious. What I'm saying here is you agreeing with the generalization which automatically forms an inductive case against your position would be something which would sufficiently establish the probability and the lack of parsimony in your position. Okay, so you would have to give a better response this time for it to actually sufficiently defeat my responses now.
Okay, so number one, if we're just applying like Apollo's retarded like notion of question begging here, then like literally every sort of like conceptual constituency given like a term would have to be like question begging, right? So like take Fermat's last theorem, for example. Like, do you take the definitions within those mathematical axioms to be question begging if they just follow like analytically from the concept?
No, but at the same time, those definitions are not
Okay,
placed
so
in
given
contention,
Jeffrey
so that's
Dahmer's like,
irrelevant.
given the fact that
Are
Jeffrey
those
Dahmer's like
definitions
moral
placed into question?
values, given the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer's moral
Answer my
values
question.
are incommensurate with the conventional standards like of the given day, of the given moral semantics, it wouldn't be question begging to say that he is acting immorally or he has like
I'm not
incommensurate
saying that
standards with that
proposition
conventional standard.
specifically alone. I'm not saying that proposition alone is. That's not even the proposition I'm questioning. I'm not questioning the
You
proposition
targeted that
of whether.
proposition. You
I'm going to
said
clarify
when
my
I was
point,
making the
okay? No,
claim
what I'm
that
telling
his
you here is that I was
concept of
never
morality,
questioning
when I said
the
that his concept of
proposition.
morality
I was
was
never
unjustified, you
questioning
said it
the
was question begging.
proposition. I
This is
was
on
never
recording. This
questioning
is
the
on recording.
proposition that
This is
Jeffrey
on
Dahmer
recording.
did
The fact that you
something
want to save
immoral.
face from this
Now,
doesn't
what you're
prove
doing
shit.
now,
Look, it's on
what you're doing
recording that you
now is
said
typical
that
autism behavior, whereas you think that giving
Jeffrey
the
Dahmer's
person no
concept,
chance to articulate the argument
when I
is a
was
good
saying
means
that
of
his
debating.
concept of
Do you
morality is
even know what my question
unjustified,
was?
you said that was question
Right?
begging. I told you it's not
What
question
part of what
begging
you
to
said do I think it's
say
question
that
begging?
given the conventional standards of the moral semantics that I'm applying, it's going to be incommensurate. That's not question begging. If you think that's
Okay,
question
so
begging, then
you
you're
don't
going to
even
have to be
track, you didn't
committed to
even
this like
track half
insane
of what I
view
said,
that
but
every
you have the
single like
audacity to give a
mathematic
complaint about what I just
theorem
said a
would
while
be
ago.
question begging just given the
Look at
fact that
me
it's like
laughing.
defined
Holy
by a
shit. Dude,
specific amount of
uh-huh.
terms, or like let's say the
Yeah, spit it
definitions of
out.
terms.
Yeah, okay, uh-huh. Spit it
You're
out. Are you
cutting
done?
out, by
Got
the
you. Now,
way.
you didn't even
You're
track.
cutting out.
I'm cutting out again.
Yeah, for me you are.
Still bugging?
No, now you're okay.
Okay, so now what I'm saying here is that you didn't even track half of what I said, but you have the audacity to criticize my point. I would say that the question begging aspect of what you were talking about was related to the specific standard that was being appealed to for demonstrating the sort of reason for his actions to be immoral. I'm not questioning
Yeah,
the actions to
dumbass.
be
I
immoral. We
said
both
that
agree on
is
that.
rounded
That's not
by the
something
concept. It's the
contending right now.
concept
I'm
that
still talking.
determines that, right?
I
So
am
if you
still
think
talking, dude.
if
I'm
you
still
think the
talking.
specific standard,
If you
what
think
this
that
is an
talking over
informal
me is a
debate,
good debate
right?
strategy,
I'm
then
going
guess
to like
what?
hop in
Reality
because
check,
you're
that's
saying
not a good
something
debate strategy.
retarded.
Shut the
You're
fuck
saying
up. Let
something
me finish
fucking
my point, and
retarded,
then you can
man.
give the
You're
response
saying something
afterwards.
fucking
You're
retarded. Look,
so
you're saying something
scared for me to finish
fucking
my
that like
point.
literally
Do you
even
want
Sasha with
moderation?
their like 60
Do you
IQ
want
would say,
moderation?
look,
Do you want
look,
moderation?
no, I don't
Do
want
you want
moderation. I
moderation?
just
Or
want to
just keep
like
talking?
correct you on your like dumbass
Okay,
points. So
so
look,
what I can
the
do easily, by the
specific
way, I
standard
have
is
termed
the
this entire
concept. The
time.
specific
I could have
standard
easily
are the
served immunity,
conceptual
but in fact, I'm
conditions.
asking
If
you,
you
do you
think that's
want the
question
because it's
begging,
very
then you're
obvious.
gonna have to be
It's
committed
very
to saying that
conspicuous
every
that you're
single
so
concept that's ever
scared for
been
me to finish
given,
my point.
every single
And you're trying
conceptual
to use
analysis
that
is
as you
question
have a better
begging.
mic.
That's
Speak over
retarded.
me so you can give people the false
I'm
impression you're actually
speaking
winning when
over
you're
you
not winning.
because you're saying
So
something
what I'm
retarded.
going to
Go
do, I'm going to
ahead. Go
continue
dig
my
your own
point.
grave.
You're
Okay, go
aping
ahead.
out again. You see, this calls for serving means. I didn't want to do this for moderation to do talking stick. I can pick a mod from any person, whereas I don't have to use terms myself. We can pick Sheik as a moderator. We can pick any person as a moderator. But because you know for a fact that I'm having connection issues and my mic is bad right now, you shouldn't speak over me to basically prevent me from giving the response which debunks your trash fucking arguments. Now, again, I'm going to give you one more chance. I'm going to unmute you. Moderation, because I don't like muting myself when I'm debating that person. Let's pick a mod from this VC. I'll give the person moderated terms, and then afterwards, I won't ever use mod terms in this conversation. Let's go. Talking stick. I shut the fuck up when you're talking and vice versa.
Okay, so look, you made a specific dumbass point. You said it's
Do
just
you
going to
want
be the
moderation? I was
specific
not done talking, by the
standard.
way. I was not done talking. Do you want moderation?
No, but you like on server muted me, so like I figured I would have like the right to speak now. You unmuted
So do
me,
you
so
want
like
moderation?
okay,
I'm muting you. I muted you when
okay,
you're
I'll
talking
mute
over
up.
me.
I'll
Yeah.
mute up. Go ramble on about why you think definitions are question begging. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay,
Go
dude.
ahead.
So no one said definitions requested begging. That's idiotic. So what I said to you, this is like another track and blunder from the supposed co-debater Arianus. No one said your definition was requested begging. I said you invoking this sort of standard to determine the immorality of actions would be begging. And obviously, we're going to say that something is going to be the type of thing which is immoral given a particular standard, which you believe conventional practices. That would not be a definition merely. That would be a proposition about the way the world is, given the conventional linguistic practices. And that is
Oh
what
my
I'm
god.
saying, and what I'm critiquing to be a question-begging argument or question-begging conclusion. So now that you understand that I was never making the claim that your definition was question-begging, which is just an obvious track and flaw on your end, I'm going to address the other parts of what you're talking about. Okay. So now, as it relates to the inductive stuff, you've not even addressed the idea in any way whatsoever that you just basically self-dunked on yourself, because guess what? You agreed on an inductive case, right, which just goes against your position. The inductive case being the vast majority of concepts that are being linguistically deployed in conversations are the types of concepts that are transparent. So unless you have sufficient evidence or reason to believe that this would be an exception, then we have strong reasons and evidence to not believe in your position. We have strong reasons to epistemologically neglect and dismiss your claim. This is the parts you're not tracking. And the other parts you're also not tracking alongside the question begging part and the part I just mentioned a while ago is the parts regarding the parsimony stuff, right? Like, if you're going to claim something to be an exception, right, then clearly there's going to be an independent proposition to accommodate for the exception you're postulating, to accommodate the entire data itself. And that would be something which makes parsimonies. So you talking about ontic parsimony is just you shut the box in, and you once again, for at least the 15th time of this conversation, failing to address my actual part of the argument that I'm actually making.
Okay, so the specific standard that was being invoked before you like rudely interrupted was the conceptual criterion, right? So there wasn't anything within that which showed that it was question begging, right? The fact that you merely said, "Oh, you're assuming a specific standard." Do you think I'm assuming a specific standard when I like invoke the concept of beauty and say that like Apollo's recessed jawline is like inconsistent with like the set of like axioms that I take something to be beautiful as? No, it's not. Right? The whole point is I have a way of like intersubjectively, just given the community that I'm in, just defining these things, right? I'm giving conceptual conditions. I'm giving like a constituency of the concept. If you think that constituency is question begging, like, okay, I welcome you to think that like all conceptual criterion for every single domain of discourse would also have to be question begging. So that's like a huge blunder in your part. Then you said something like retarded that was like asinine, where you said, oh, you're like introducing like an exclusion to like the generalized set of propositions that would like constitute like opaque moral language. Well, first of all, like opaque moral language is consistent with having like theoretical simplicity. So I'm not sure how you're like establishing specifically how I'm like theoretically inflating like my economy, right? Take for example like people that are constructivists about math. They're wanting to say, yes, there are these like mathematical truths that are conventional, but we have like vast conceptual opacity to these like mathematical truths because like for example there's going to be like vast conceptual revision. Like even the person that came up with Fermat's last theorem, I think his name is like Andrew Wiles or Anthony Wiles or some shit like that. He, for example, would say he doesn't have translucent or transparent epistemic access to like all the mathematical concepts or the mathematical facts, but nevertheless he's giving an account specifically what those facts are without like introducing new theoretic types. So if you think that my case like for these like moral concepts being vastly opaque is like theoretically inflated, how do you deal with like the analogy to like mathematical facts? Do you think mathematical facts or like this sort of like mathematical realism is like theoretically inflated? Because that's just like retarded, right? Just the simple fact that like there's some sort of like epistemic lack of translucency doesn't mean that like the theory within itself is like introducing so many laws and complexities that can be accounted for by the concept that's being used.
Yeah, just
Now
to
you
just just to address the first part of what you were talking about. Again, you keep on going back to the point that relates to you saying that, well, given my account of quest and begging, then we have to basically say that when you're invoking these sort of like, definitions or concepts of beauty, for example, or quest and begging, no, buddy, because guess what? In this case scenario, I'm saying that the thing which would be quest and begging is the fundamental claim you'd be making for its appearance of your kind of normative justification. That fundamental claim being that most people use normative justification in this you're talking about, which is index to motivations. That's the fundamental claim you'd be making. The idea that your kind of justification, given your kind of coherency, would in fact be coherent. So that's not even something which comes even close, remotely close to addressing my point. Not to mention the other part of quest and begging, which you fail to actually address, by the way, is the part where it's the thing that one is assuming is in question, or rather is in contention, right? Not all types of assumptions are quest and begging. Like obviously in this case scenario, in this debate, in this dialectic, there are things that we're actively assuming that we have not presented any active justification. However, these things will not be formed by and begging because neither of us interlocutors are placing these things into question, nor are these things on the table for contention, right? I'm saying that the thing that you're talking about, which you believe is correspondent with or is consistent with conventional linguistic practices, I'm saying that specific concept and that claim you'd be making based off the conceptual status quo, that is what is in question. And so even if you're assuming that, it's not the assumption which makes it sufficient for it to be quest begging, it's the assumption as well as the fact that it is in question and it's being contended skeptically or from a skeptical perspective, which is what makes question begging. You've not presented any sort of sufficient independent motivation, rather justification for the claim, and you have not shown why you're not just merely assuming this. So that would qualify as question begging. Now, the other mentioned about mathematical realism, such a dog piss example. It's like I'm actually feeling second embarrassment listening to you embarrassing yourself like you are right. The mathematical realism part, in that case scenario, there are no unnecessary antiposits for mathematical realism. In fact, there's evidence favoring it, and I would say that it is even entailed given the correct view of formal ontology that mathematical realism is true. And so there's not being unnecessary posits for mathematical realism for it to be the case that it would be less parsimonious.
Okay, so first of all, the view that was given, so if you think that, like, for example, there's one specific proposition which is inconsistent with the account that I gave, where I'm like giving you conceptual constraints as to like what I think the concept of morality tracks, please tell me like what you think, what proposition is like contradicting that with what I said.
Sorry, I went away for a while, so I wasn't actually done talking. But ask me the question, I'll address that question, and then I'll continue what I was saying after. There's one more point I was supposed to address regarding the consistency stuff. So re-ask the question, and then I'll give my response to it. Go for it.
No, just continue. Like, just lay
Oh
out
yeah, sure.
everything and then I'll listen.
I think you mentioned one last point regarding it being the case that um your argument or you postulating the moral domains to be like this sort of thing which is not conceptually transparent is consistent with it being more parsimonious. It is only consistent with it being more parsimonious in the absence of probabilistic evidence against that claim. But in this case, we have probabilistic evidence against that claim. The probabilistic evidence being the inductive case that I've just established a while ago in the attempt of showing why your view would be less likely, and I've explained to you why inductive cases are going to be probability rated sufficiently ceteris paribus. The reason being that it is the type of thing like for any hypothesis A, you learned this in archaic information theory, and then the hypothesis for any hypothesis A, sorry, if that hypothesis is asserted by it is the case that that hypothesis, although being a lower complexity than the opposing hypothesis, which makes it more parsimonious. That's the kind of parsimony I'm appealing to, and that's the kind of parsimony which, by the way, is established by mathematics to be probability reason. So any other kind of parsimony that you might be invoking to address my point to be relevant fundamentally to what my argument actually is. Now that that is clarified and being hashed out, just ask me that question you were asking me when I was away for a second, and then we can just get on to that, and you can give your responses to the points I've made previously.
Okay, great. So, like, first of all, there wasn't any assumption that was being made, right? So, if you think like me giving a conceptual analysis as to like what the term morality generally tracks, just given like commensurate conventional standards is question begging, then you don't even know what the fuck question begging is, right? And that's very obvious just giving your responses. You don't know what that is. The second part is you said specifically, okay, there's going to be like an element to mathematical realism which would have to posit like some sort of like ontic inflation. I never made any claim about ontic inflation. I'm just saying like specifically if you think that there's like vast transparency or like let's say vast opacity within the domain of like moral discourse, what is going to be the probability raising factor that because there's like this sort of like epistemic fact about how most people interpret those concepts, that necessarily they're invoking like complex structures to like explain that, right? Your view basically entails that like for any position like in mathematics, for example, when evaluating these concepts, it would have to necessarily be the case that it's going to be theoretically inflated. Either the realist position is going to be theoretically inflated, just given the fact that they have like some exclusionary proposition that they're adding into the background, or the constructivist position. But clearly, we can tell that the constructivist position is positing less theoretic types than the realist. So your view must be false. It cannot be the case that just because there's like vast transparency within the domain of like mathematical concepts, for example, that would necessarily make it the case, or even make it more likely the case, that there's going to be like theoretical inflation for both models, right? In the moral domain, it's the exact same thing. There's going to be certain facts about like specifically indexing it to like moral propositions, that those moral propositions cannot be interpreted in a way that's translucent, okay? The translucency doesn't negate the fact that there's like some sort of like theoretic simplicity to explaining why some people just have a hard time of understanding the concept. It might just be the case that like there's some sort of like epistemic or mental block that is like sort of like grounding these concepts. It might be the case that like for example, Jeffrey Dahmer just isn't aware of like what those facts are, but nevertheless he has a concept of motivation. Okay, how does that contradict the claim that like motivational justification is indexed to the community, right? Indexed to the intersubjective standards of a given society? It doesn't, right? Because the whole point is I'm giving you a concept of what justification is. It's ingrained within like the societal standards. There's one person who in this context isn't aware or doesn't have like translucent access to those facts. That doesn't result in a contradiction. That just means they're not aware of that concept transparency. They're not aware of the fact that that concept is sort of shared in a way that would like limit his motivations or like limit the case for him being justified by having those motivations and for them acting them out, right? So you fail to provide a contradiction within my semantic analysis of moral. And it's just funny how you said I couldn't track that when the whole conversation has just been you either strawmanning or just you not tracking what the conventional semantics are. And then you fail to respond to the point about theoretic inflation, right? If your view is true, then like every single like theory within mathematics would have to be theoretically inflated, just given the fact that like most would interpret there'd be like vast mathematical conceptual opacity for every given like mathematical theorem, right? Including Fermat's last theorem, any theorem you want, right? So please tell me, Apollo, is it the case that you think that all views in the domain of mathematics are theoretically inflated, including the mathematical realist and the mathematical constructivist? If you think so, please tell me how that specifically applies to the moral domain. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the whole bunch of like, you're not tracking accusations is just really embarrassing, because no one actually, I mean, if you've listened to my point that I made previously, I made it clear explicitly that mathematical realism would not be the type of view which is theoretically inflated, because the proposition of mathematical realism is something which has to be postulated given what it means for something to even be real or something to even exist. That's what I told you. So it would not be postulating any unnecessary propositions to explain the data, which, by the way, is something which qualifies a view for be parsimonious or for it to not be parsimonious. You've not even explained or even specified the exclusionary proposition that mathematical realism would be postulating, and you have not established, again, I don't even know what you mean by theoretical types. I think type token distinction is really vague. So you'd have to elaborate as to how it would be the case necessarily that mathematical constructivism is the type of thing which is a type insofar as, or sorry, it postulates, you could say, less theoretical types. Even then, even if you don't explain that, which you've not really been doing any rational, intelligent explanation the entire time, even if you dodge that part, which you most definitely will dodge that part of the counter arguments I'm given right now, the other part, which you mentioned about the idea of conventional semantics, is even more relevant. It's even more destructive for your end, because then I was basically explaining to you, which you repeatedly dodge on numerous occasions. You've not yet addressed the inductive part, right? I've told you that the semantical intuitions, right, that we would be appealing to for the sake of making claims about whatever semantics you're invoking in conversations, those semantical intuitions diverges from the claim that what we mean or what we're referring to by normative justification is something which is indexed to mere motivations, either from one person or the vast majority of people in a given society. So again, you haven't addressed that part. Well, again, I guess I should say you attempted to address this, but the addressal or the response you've given those dogmas, your response is you talking about the idea of this concept regarding normative justification not being conceptually transparent. You have not given any evidence for this claim. I've given evidence for why it would actually be the type of thing which is not, well, it would be transparent, given the fact that you agreed verbatim that the vast majority of concepts that people use in conversations are transparent. You've not given any independent reason as to why this would be a justified exception. So, therefore, you then have to concede, if you want to be consistent with what evidence really is, that this would be the type of thing which is, in fact, transparent, which would go against the notion that most people actually invokes the same sort of conventional linguistic practice, or sorry, they invoke the same sort of linguistic practices that you would be invoking when you're talking about ethics. Because again, just to clarify for the audience, including you, because I know for a fact that you're not understanding jack shit of what I'm talking about, right? If it is the case that people have transparent epistemic access to the concept of normative justification, right, just like how they have transparent epistemic access to the concept of bachelor, then just like how people would obviously say that if let's say the president of France was to be unmarried, he would be a bachelor. Likewise, people would also say that if the vast majority of people in society were to be motivated towards genocide in people would be justified. But obviously, if you ask the average person if this is to be the case, if raping babies is okay, if the vast majority of people are motivated and such, they would say no. They would say that's not the case. So if that was to be a transparent concept, which I've presented all the evidence for it would be a transparent concept regarding normativity, then considering this other intuition we have regarding people not believing such, which you've agreed on, and it would be the case that your concept of normative justification, and I repeat, your concept of normative justification, you slow boy, would be something which is incoherent given your own fucking standards. So I don't know why this is so complex for you to track. This like really rudimentary philosophy freaking logic right here, but it's pretty obvious just given what you said previously, given the criteria you've laid out for coherency and subsequent criteria for your other concepts, that there is some level of incompatibility. You cannot make the claim that this is coherent given the other specific facts as it relates to the evidence in favor of this being a transparent concept, as well as the intuitions that people have about the case scenarios I've just presented on the table for the fourth time. So what I'm expecting from you is not another cheerful response, but a better response this time.
Okay, so look, um, there's a couple of things there. So number one, yes, mathematical realism for sure is going to introduce like new theoretic and ontic types. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Like if you're invoking like some sort of like ontic realist categorical scheme that isn't solely dependent on like how the convention devises these terms, and you're positing those conventional theorems plus some fact in the world that sort of makes these theorems the case, right? Makes these theorems true and justified. I don't even know how you think that's not like introducing a new ontic type within the system. The constructivist just posits the convention and eliminates any need or like let's say any sort of grounding relation between the mathematical facts and like any sort of like external facts to the mathematical convention. So you were wrong on that part. Yes, they're introducing an inflated categorical scheme, and for you to say so is just like utterly ridiculous. Second part is the whole point about like transparency or opacity is going to be determinate on whether or not there's like vast conceptual revision. We see, empirically speaking, vast moral disagreement upon what's considered to be moral or immoral, just given the fact that there's like billions upon billions of people that disagree specifically on what morality is trying to get at, even in terms of like normative ethics or meta ethics, right? You have the burden of like explaining, since you think it's like vastly transparent that these like moral concepts are tracking something, right? That necessarily, or even makes it the case that it's like highly likely that, you know, the moral disagreement that we have could be better explained by the fact that we just have one transparent concept, but for whatever reason, we just happen to like disagree fundamentally on what that concept is, right? It seems like more plausible, just given the view of like moral disagreement, especially the type of moral disagreement where there is just, except for like a few things like slavery, rape, murder, etc., where there's just like wide disagreement upon those things, that's like less expected under the view that's like opaque in comparison to yours, where you have the burden to say it's transparent, but nevertheless we find this like intriguing concept of like people vastly disagreeing upon these things for, I don't know, whatever reason you have in mind, right? It seems like your view is much more implausible because when we have specific domains like mathematics, there's going to be vast disagreement upon like which mathematical theorem is going to be preferable, just given like these set of axioms, right? And like any mathematician will tell you, especially like philosophers of mathematics will tell you, yes, the vast conceptual revision for these theorems, the fact that we have like vast incommensurate disagreement upon like whether or not the concepts in Fermat's last theorem are actually tracking the mathematical facts, points that they're vastly opaque. Because if they were transparent, we would expect that just given the fact that we like have a grasp of the concept fully, we wouldn't have like such incommensurability. We would see what that concept entails, right? And we wouldn't have to revise our theories as much because obviously we're like tracking what the mathematical facts are in a way that's more efficient than what we currently have, right? So your position entails something completely ridiculous where you have to say, yes, it's pretty clear to most people what these moral intuitions are trying to track, but nevertheless we just happen to like vastly disagree upon whether or not these things could even be considered like moral or immoral. And the struggle to like basically use moral language, sort of track those facts, just shows that it's opaque. Just look at the domain of meta ethics. There's like thousands upon thousands of papers dealing with what the type of moral language that's being deployed is trying to get at, right? And there seems to be very little substantive progress within the field as to what specifically we're trying to refer to when we use these moral terms. I'm just going to take it, given like Sider's principle, Ted Sider's principle of verbal disputes, that if a specific domain involves like vast verbal disputes, right? Vast like verbal disputes over substantive disputes, it's more likely than not that we're warranted in like deflating our like theoretical and ontic scheme when it comes to that domain, because it's not getting at anything, it's not tracking anything. It's most likely the case that we're just like semantically jibber jabbering, like you like to say. And I think that's also true within the case of morality. When it comes to morality, it seems like we're just having these like verbal disputes as to what's moral or immoral, right? Jeffrey Dahmer just disagrees with the vast majority of people, and his concept of morality doesn't track like the general concept of what most people mean when they say that they're like motivationally or morally justified, right? So that's perfectly plausible under that view. And it specifically means that just given the context in which I'm speaking from, the vast conceptual revision of these moral concepts, as they would do for like the mathematical domain, suggests that these moral concepts are vastly opaque and not transparent. If they were transparent, we would expect under their hypothesis that there would be substantially less moral disagreement, right? Just given the fact that these people just track the concepts fully. And we wouldn't see vast conceptual revision of these like meta-ethical models, right? For example, like consequentialism or rule consequentialism and things of that sort, right? So you haven't dealt with any of that. Now you can respond.
Okay, got you. So, just to address a couple of things, you think for some reason the principle you mentioned, the thing regarding the vast disagreements about, you could say, the facts, the moral facts, there's good reason to believe that there's a disagreement or there's confusion about, you could say, not even confusion, but rather it's good reason to believe and the absence of conceptual transparency, which is not even the case. You agreed even previously that in most case scenarios, in most conversations, in most linguistic practices, okay, when you have disagreements by the parts of your, not even disagreements, but when you're invoking concepts, okay, these concepts are transparent. You agree to this, right? But guess what? Even outside the maths, right, we're going to be talking about like physics, for example, or anything regarding the empirics, right? Even though it is the case that in the majority of like conversations, the majority of the concepts you're using in these domains or conversations are transparent, there are still vast disagreements outside of even ethics. We have disagreements about even whether the Earth is flat or non-flat. Now, obviously, we would not say that we don't have a clear understanding or transparent understanding of the concept of flatness versus non-flatness. We do have a clear understanding of such, right? But there's still vast disagreement throughout from the ancient Greek era coming to even this time regarding whether or not the Earth is flat or whether it is non-flat. Okay, so vast disagreement about, you could say, the facts related to a given concept does not serve as sufficient evidence for there to be vast disagreement about the, you could say, conceptual evaluation type facts, right? So you can have a grasp of the concept fully without having grasp of the synthetic non-conceptual facts as it relates to said concepts. Like, for example, the flat Earth example. We both have a clear understanding, everyone here, because we're not completely retarded, but with a clear understanding of what it means for something to be flat, what flatness looks like, what non-flatness looks like, at least in the context of evaluating the shape of the Earth, for example. But irrespective of such, right, there is in fact, and there has been in fact in the past, and I'm pretty sure there still is, some levels of vast disagreements about the shape of the Earth. And this is just one example, one out of a plethora of examples, right, outside of the ethical domains, whereas we have vast disagreements, right? We have more vast disagreements in non-ethical domains than we do in ethical domains. And there are also more convergence in the ethical domain. So it's kind of like funny how you kind of like nitpick. This is the typical obscurantist rhetoric I was talking about, right? You nitpick certain things and ignore other details, which shits on your own points. There's more convergence. Like, obviously, the average person would say that it is the case that it is wrong to rape babies. Like, that's fucking disgusting. That's wrong. Like, if you take like a 3-year-old kid, for example, and just like fucking have sex with that kid with no freaking consent, that's wrong. The average person would say this. That's moral convergence right there. So if you believe that moral divergence, vast disagreement, right, is the type of thing which indicates in absence of conceptual transparency, I want to know why you don't believe that moral convergence is the type of thing which is evidence for there to be conceptual transparency. Now, last but not least, you talk about the idea of the irreducibility of moral language from the linguistic agents that are participating in moral discourses. That is equally expected under the view that moral concepts or moral terminologies or linguistic tokens are semantically primitive. So semantic primitivity equally expects the data you're appealing to to generate this dogfish arguments against my position. And not to mention the other claims you made got undercut by the moral convergence response, and also the other response I've made regarding the lack of synonymy between, you could say, disagreements about facts pertaining to the concept, which can be external to the concept, and the conceptual facts, which are going to be internal, right? So those are another set of points you'd have to address. You have not really. Oh, by the way, another tracking blunder you made, I typed it out in the chat just to make sure I did not forget. You're talking about, oh, I don't see how mathematical realism is not postulating or making any theoretical posits. I'm not saying that it is not making any posits, any ontic theoretical posits. I was saying it was not making any unnecessary, and I repeat, any unnecessary posits, you dumbass. I was not saying it was not making any posits whatsoever. And then, by the way, if something is making necessary posits, then saying that having those posits as a part of that specific theoretical landscape makes it less parsimonious is retarded, because when you're talking about the principle of parsimony or Occam's razor, whatever terminology you want to use to basically describe this concept, okay? When you're talking about that, we're talking about entities or propositions should not be multiplied beyond necessity. If these propositions are necessary given the epistemic data we have to be postulated, then we have strong reason to postulate these propositions, and so they would not be violating the background principle of parsimony. So you mentioning and you talking about how this view as XYZ among the posits does not sufficiently justify it being less parsimonious given my standard, because my standard is not just confined just mere postulation of propositions, but it also depends on the necessity or the relevancy of affirming these propositions given the data we have access to, epistemically speaking. So that's just basically it. Let's see if we can give a better response this time. I'm done talking.
Okay, so first of all, like, yes, I was making the case that like mathematical realism would in this case be unnecessarily adding like theoretic types within the categorical scheme that they're deploying, right? So I don't know like what specifically you didn't track. I necessarily said, yes, they're adding in unnecessary parts within their categorical scheme. The conventionalists or the like constructivists about mathematics can equally as well appeal to like the mathematical facts just being grounded by the conventional schemes, but they're not like introducing these like very queer metaphysically strange properties like external to the mathematical facts, right? Or any sort of like Platonist facts would sort of like account for what the mathematical facts are, right? So the point that you just said is just like completely retarded. Then the second part is, yes, you wanted to say there's moral convergence, but let's actually examine that. There's moral convergence when it comes to things like slavery, rape, like someone molesting a baby, right? Most people would say, if not the 99.9% of people in like the world would say, yes, that is fucking disgusting. Okay, that doesn't mean that given these like examples that you've individuated, that it doesn't get vastly outweighed by the vast, and I mean vast, incommensurate sort of like disagreements that we have about morality in general. Like there's constant disagreement about abortion, whether or not homosexuality should be legalized, whether or not it's moral, just given the fact that like whether or not lending interest is moral, can give you countless examples, right? Expropriating property, just given the fact that you want to like impose taxes on someone's property. There's countless examples. You've only given like 2 or 3 examples to sort of like respond to like the overwhelming evidence that there is vast moral disagreement. And I didn't just say overwhelming moral disagreement. I also added in the conjunction that there's vast verbal disputes. Obviously, there's going to be vast disagreement within the domain of physics about Everettianism or quantum mechanics or, spooky action at a distance and things like that. But these things typically are not regressive to the field, right? Okay, there's vast disagreement within the field of physics about these different things, but you'd have to be a moron to say they're only talking about like verbal disputes and not actually pointing to something in the world substantively. You can't do that with the moral domain. You can't do that specifically within things like philosophy of mind, where there's been no empirical progression within the field. It just seems like when people sort of like devise these concepts, they're necessarily just wanting to say, okay, this semantic scheme is incompatible with X semantic scheme. And then we just have like different motivations for like each of those different views. But that doesn't necessarily entail nor show that it's more likely than not that the concepts that are deployed within that domain are transparent. If anything, if there's conceptual transparency within the domain, there could still be, some disagreement about which moral theory is correct, of course, right? We see this like in physics, there's some disagreements about like whether or not quantum indeterminacy is true. Okay, whatever. And quantum physics, that's specifically the case. But those fields don't point typically to some sort of like empirically regressive hypothesis, right? It's speculative, right? Some of it is speculative, but it's not speculative to the point where there's just vast disagreement and we're just engaging in verbal disputes all the time, which is something that I brought in and you didn't respond to, by the way. There's vast verbal disputes that show that the field in question in which we're deploying these concepts of are not going to be, number one, empirically fruitful, and number two, are not theoretically fruitful to the concepts that are being used, then I'm just going to take it that the field in question, the concepts that are being used within that field, are just vastly opaque, right? The fact is, it's not just a satisfactory sort of like part of the conjunction to say there's vast disagreement, therefore there's like vast conceptual opacity. No, it's vast disagreement plus there hasn't been any progression in these fields to sort of justify any sort of like claim about moral intuitions that you're giving, right? Third of all, even if most people were to say Apollo is like immoral, right? Because I don't know, the XYZ pedophilia allegations, right, that came out on Discord. And that's not a knife at you, by the way, that's just an example. I'm just saying it doesn't follow from that necessarily the people that have like that sort of concept of like pedophilia are like going to be justified, right? It doesn't even make it more likely because that's equally expected under the view that like all these semantics are like conventionally ingrained, right? But they just happen to disagree what the threshold should be for pedophilia, whether or not like an 18-year-old person could get with like a 16-year-old, things like that, right? So there's going to be disagreements about the particular details as to what would constitute something being immoral, just given those contexts, right? But the fact that there hasn't been like any sort of like theoretic fruitfulness within these fields to sort of suggest that we're tracking something in the world and not just like merely talking about verbal disputes suggests that these concepts are vastly opaque. And number two, that we're justified in deflating our ontology unless we're given a reason, an independent justification as to why we should do that, right, to accommodate our language. And that's also the case with mathematical realism, okay? Why should it be the case that we should posit these like external mathematical facts if the same sort of like mathematical opacity is going to be expected under constructivism, but we're not supposing like weird theoretic or ontic types in order to explain it. It's all empirically ingrained, just given off the fact that we have like certain revisionary schemes that can sort of like change the way that we sort of like deploy and use these theorems. The same is true within the domain of morality. Why do we need to suppose that there are these like different moral facts, like these stance independent moral facts to make these claims about what's moral or immoral, just given like a communitarian or intersubjective context, right? Now you can respond. And by the way, I'm gonna go
Okay,
get
so
something
just a
very
couple of
quickly,
things you
so
think for some
I'll be
reason called
listening. I'll
or
be
about.
listening, but yeah, I just have to get a charger, by the way. But I'll be listening. Go ahead.
Okay, gotcha. So just to address the parts regarding the lack of fruitfulness, theoretical or empirical fruitfulness in the context or in the domain of ethics, I disagree with that. You think that moral convergence is implications or indications of there being some sort of like moral progression, I should say, is indication of there being some sense of fruitfulness, theoretically or empirically speaking, in ethics. But we see several instances of progression in the domain of ethics. if you want to talk about decolonization, for example, like how colonialism is widely condemned, which wasn't the case back then, or if you want to talk about gender equality, sorry, which is something which was not as one could say dominant or dominant aspect of society as it is right now. You know, these things are not the sort of like faces of the societies from the past, right? These are just merely the faces of society of the contemporaneous times, the current times, okay? And these are just a couple of examples. What about the abolition of slavery, for example? That's another example. So there are multiple different instances, right, of like you could say things which indicates moral progress. Okay, these are just a few instances, a few couple of examples. Not to mention the fact that back then we had barbaric men who were like cavemen, for example, who were cannibals. Right, cannibalism, for example, is something which is widely condemned currently. But back then, if we're talking about thousands upon thousands years ago, it is the case that cannibalism was something which was practiced a lot more than it is right now. Whereas currently it is widely morally condemned. It is something which is morally looked down upon, in contrast with before, whereas it was something which is far more practiced. These are clear, obvious, conspicuous indications of moral progress. So if you think moral progress is indication of theoretical, if not empirical fruitfulness, given the examples I've given, which demonstrates moral progress, then you then have to bite the bullet and say that there's some level of theoretical fruitfulness. By the way, you've not demonstrated the claim that there's no theoretical fruitfulness for the gain. You've not demonstrated that claim. So that's something which has to be proven as well. Not to mention, you said that there are vast disagreements in ethics, which is not something which is disagreed upon. However, there are also vast agreements. You have not shown why there are more vast disagreements than there are vast. There are at least 10 examples I can list off the top of my head where there is moral convergence, right? If we're going to be talking about, for instance, lying is something which is generally perceived to be immoral, right? Theft is generally conceived to be immoral. Or, for example, kidnapping, human trafficking, severe physical abuse of children, or even slavery, as you mentioned, and torture. These are case scenarios which people agree widely that these things are immoral. So just like how you gave countless examples, as you like to call it, for there being vast disagreements, I've just given countless examples of there being vast agreements. So again, if you want to make a case for an absence of conceptual transparency to justify why your position is inevitably or fundamentally coherent, you'd have to, number one, show why there are more cases of vast disagreements for vast agreements, for it to have stronger evidence in favor of conceptual opaqueness over conceptual transparency. And also, I've given you a reason there is evidence as to why it would be more likely to be conceptually transparent, given inductive cases you've agreed as it relates to the vast majority of concepts being transparent. Okay, so considering that into consideration or placing that into consideration, the vast majority, if not all, the evidence we have available is my proposition, my conclusion, my belief that I'm pushing forth here over the unsubstantiated belief that you're just bloviating over, which has no sort of substance to back it up. Now, last but not least, you talk about the lack of necessity of postulating external mathematical facts. One could also postulate the lack of necessity to explain mathematical facts. I don't think about external mathematical facts automatically means that there is some sort of, you could say, increase in the amount of posits taken to explain the data, the mathematical data, because both the mathematical constructivist and the mathematical realist at face value are certain one proposition to explain the data at face value. The respective propositions being that for mathematical realists, they're postulating that the mathematical data are explained by the external mathematical facts that you appeal to or that you referenced in your response, and the mathematical constructivist is explaining that in virtue of some constructivist framework. Sorry. So, with that being said, I've addressed and I could say completely torn to pieces the vast disagreement type argument you tried to give for the lack of conceptual transparency or the existence of conceptual opaqueness in the context of ethics. And I've given independent evidence as to why it is more likely that these concepts are transparent outside of the agreement, disagreement slash argument, right? That evidence being the agreements you made previously regarding the preponderance of cases of concepts being employed in conversations linguistically being the types of concepts which are transparent. So with that being said, as we both already know, the establishment of the opaqueness slash transparency of moral concepts directly ties back to the justification that you would have for believing that your concept is coherent, or that I would have for believing that your concept of normative justification is incoherent, which, by the way, would just be evidence against your anti-realist position. So that's just basically it. Let me know if you have any other responses, and if so, and if not, we can just move on to a different point regarding your arguments and so forth.
Okay, so number one specifically, yes, specifically, you've like mentioned these examples of moral progress, given the fact that there is gender equality, abolition of slavery, things like that. The thing when I'm referencing, when I say that this thing lacks empirical fruitfulness, right? Empirical fruitfulness is just accommodating for the data after the fact, after these things happened, and then say, here, look, here's an example of progress. No, when theoretic progress or empirical progress are posited, it's a theory that has to do with whether or not it has like novel predictive utility, or it has like some sort of like predictive process where someone makes a hypothesis, right? They evaluate the data, and just given what's expected within the theory, if X is widely predicted and it happens, then that means that that theory has predictive success, right? What you're doing is you're basically accommodating for the data ad hocly after the fact, just given the fact that you want to individuate certain examples that sort of supports your point, right? As an example, cherry picking, right? When I say that these theories are not, right, empirically fruitful, I'm saying just given the way that they're defined conceptually, it doesn't seem like they raise significantly the probability of this view being fruitful insofar as like it's able to predict convergences, right? Especially the type of convergences that would outweigh the vast moral disagreement that we have in the moral domain, right? So just like basically accommodating for the fact that there's progress, right? Or whatever you take progress to be, doesn't sufficiently justify the claim that there is actually theoretic progress within the field, right? If anything, we see the direct opposite in the domain of metaethics, right? There's several different positions which are vastly incommensurate with each other, right? They yield similar indeterminate results. It seems like moral realism, if it were true, I'm taking the position in this debate it isn't, it would yield vast ontic indeterminacy. There seems to be like no sort of like explanation that's been given by the moral realist as to why it's indispensable to posit these like new theoretic or ontic types in order to explain the data. Similarly, when it comes to like things like mathematical realism, yes, of course they're going to have to posit new mathematical laws, right? So what you said about like, oh, if they're going to posit like external mathematical facts, it can't be the case, or it makes it very unlikely that it's the case that they're going to inflate their ontology or they're going to inflate their theoretic scheme by positing these external facts, because they're not like introducing new propositions. Well, the new proposition that's being introduced is that there are these like existential facts, there are these like ontic facts, these like ontically committing mathematical facts. Not only do they ground the mathematical facts just given our convention, but they widely, hyper-intentionally ground like all the facts concerning about mathematical revision and mathematical like conceptual opacity and things of that sort. Whereas like the constructivist only needs to posit one ontic type. They only need to posit just the community, right? The mathematical community that devises these like mathematical rules of reasoning, these like ways of like designing theorems and things like that. What the externalist needs to do is to basically posit all that, plus they have to plus add in all this stuff about, okay, there are these facts out there, and they sort of like explain specifically what is being referenced when we say, oh, there are these like facts concerning like how we should design our theories, right? So yes, it's going to be like more ontically and theoretically inflated. Then there's a part of like, okay, vast disagreement plus verbal disputes makes it more likely that there is like conceptual opacity within the field. But I don't know what to say to you, right? There hasn't been like any sort of like predictive outlier by any sort of like moral realist position that's been offered that would like make it more likely that we have these like vast examples of convergence outweighing moral disagreement. If anything, we see the exact opposite. You've only named like 3 examples, okay? And by the way, you did that in an accommodationist factor. I was basically just highlighting how the fact that you gave, like, yes, you gave 10 examples as you're writing in chat, but I'm saying even those 10 examples, you didn't give like any sort of like predictive hypothesis for them. You basically just tried to accommodate after the fact by saying, yes, there are these like historical examples, but that doesn't mean that it's going to like raise the probability of the view being true, right? So like the fact that you think, oh, I'm just going to accommodate for the fact that there's like gender abolition, sorry, not gender abolition, there's like gender equality, there's like slavery abolition, things like that. It doesn't warrant the case that there's like empirical fruitfulness in the field, you fucking dumbass. It's just showing, look, you have like an ad hoc way of explaining things. I've given you criteria for what would count as theoretic or empirical fruitfulness, and you're failing to track that.
Yeah, so there you go. The blabbering ape projection is track of disabilities. Oh shit. So anyway, just to address a couple of things. So you talk about the idea of there not being any sort of predictions regarding the examples that I've given, right? You have not even established, given a moral anti-realist framework as to how it would be the case that that view, you fucking dumbass, as you like to put it, is making any sort of predictions as to why we would even have these vast disagreements. And I can actually establish a potential case as to why these would be predicted by the moral realist. Even you can even just like how you can use evolution as a means of like explaining morality or ethics in the favor of the more anti-realist framework. You can do the exact same for moral realism insofar as we know that it is more expected given evolutionary biology and given neurochemistry and the fact that we as human beings develop what is called a sensory motor ground in our brains, for example. Right? Given that specifically, the intuitions we have towards a particular belief or about a belief being correct is evidence for that belief being representative of some objective fact and not just a mere illusion or just mere desires or motivations or mental attitudes, okay? And so the intuitions we have, right, which inevitably or ends up converging with these particular case scenarios being immoral would be more expected given the fact that we have evolved over time and we are becoming beings which are more acquainted with the relevant facts of the universe, right? The benefits our, you could say, our scenario of being harmed or the potentiality of not being harmed, right? So you could even appeal to those sort of standards and say that, okay, given the nature of intuitions, given the facts of evolutionary biology and neurochemistry, or neurobiology, I should say, it would be the case that us having these intuitions in the current time in contrast to the prior times, right, is just an indication of our intuitions becoming more accurate over time, just like how our intuitions and our epistemic equipments in the field of physics and in other fields like, for example, chemistry and so forth, are becoming more acquainted with the relevant facts of those fields. So that analogy, whereas I can just basically draw you could say, similarity between how our epistemic equipments are becoming more effective over time in the field of physics, and you could say biology and chemistry to know the facts better, could also be applied in the case of ethics. And I can just couple that with the fact that it's more expected, given evolutionary biology or evolution theory, that intuitions we have are representative of objective facts and not just mere stance-dependent facts. Now, moving on from that, to just the other part, you talked about the idea of a mathematical realist having to posit the community. That's like one of the worst blunders you have committed in this conversation. They don't have to posit that, you fucking moron, you underdeveloped ape. They don't even need to talk about the community to explain why these mathematical data even exist. They can just talk about a non-community related fact. So for you to tell me right here, right now, to my face, with a serious face, by the way, that they have to posit the community to explain the data is ridiculous. It's, as you like to call it, asinine. So moving on from that, you have utilitarian frameworks of moral realism, which predicts these convergence. right? It is expected under utilitarianism, which is compatible with moral realism, that we would have these types of convergences. These types of convergences as it relates to, you could say, rape being wrong or sexual assault being wrong, or you could say, torture being wrong. The list goes on, right? These things are predicted under utilitarianism. And by the way, when I use the word predict, I'm not sure if you even understand what that word even means, but by prediction, I'm just talking about conditional probability of a given view being correct given the particular data, right? So if the conditional probability of some given hypothesis being true is above 0.5 to a considerable degree, given the particular data which is being analyzed by a particular agent, it would be the case that that particular hypothesis has predictions, that predictions being the data which serves as evidence for that position, right? So if that's the accounts of predictions you're going under, by the way, then it would be the case that this would be something which makes predictions. And by the way, you specified novel predictions as if you're trying to confine the domain of predictions to novelty, which is, again, ridiculous. If you're talking about novel predictions insofar as predictions which are things which are more expected under a given hypothesis, which was discovered in the future, for example, then that's obviously not the only type of predictions. You can make non-novel predictions, and those predictions will still be good evidence, right? Take, for example, post-predictions, right? Trivial predictions given evolution, for example, given evolutionary biology, evolutionary theory, those still serve as evidence, right? And we can use these sort of like predictions and trace these back to paleontology. So even if those types of predictions are trivial insofar as this obviously expected, it still would be the case that it serves as sufficient evidence, right? So the triviality or the novelty of a given prediction does not necessarily legitimize or disqualify something from being evidence, right? You can have non-trivial prediction which serves as strong fucking evidence for a given claim. So that's just another blunder again that you made argumentatively. So with that being said, you've not even addressed the idea of, well, you try to basically lie your way out of it, talking about, oh, you just presented 3 examples, which you corrected yourself afterwards. It was 10 examples. The examples I've given of moral convergence, given your own words, would be something which serves as evidence for theoretical and or empirical fruitfulness, because you said previously, and I repeat, you said previously verbatim, that the moral convergence data, right, about like agreements and so forth, as well as moral progress, would be something which indicates there being some sort of fruitfulness. And you don't think it has any of these sort of things. You didn't, at that time at least, you didn't believe or didn't adopt the position, because you said explicitly that you don't think that there's any sort of moral convergence or progress which should serve as evidence for there being theoretical and or empirical fruitfulness, which, by the way, I've just contradicted. I've actually shown the latter. I've shown the opposite, that there is in fact a plethora of instances of both moral convergence and moral progress, which under your standard would serve as evidence for there to be either theoretical or empirical fruitfulness for this given proposition. So given your own standard, I've shown evidence for why this position is theoretically fruitful. Given your own standard of coherency, I've shown why your position is in fact incoherent. And I'm pretty sure, given everyone else's own standard of what constitutes a good argument, a bad argument, your arguments and your position was definitely dogfish and needs better work. So we can see if we're going to develop better responses. I've given you plenty of chances to redeem yourself. Clearly, you have not taken upon those chances. We can get to conclusions pretty soon after this.
Okay, so that was a lot. So, first of all, I never specifically made a claim about like novelty or like predictive novelty as just being the only marker for like predictive success. I'm just highlighting it as like a primary condition for there being predictive success within a theory. So, you weren't tracking that point. Second of all, I made it very specific to you that like sure, you can appeal to these like evolutionary accounts or these like consequentialist accounts to sort of like basically in principle try to draw predictive success from those theories. But the problem is you're sort of like invoking naturalistic evolution, the development of our like cognitive psychology, of our like cognitive architecture, to sort of basically say it's like highly expected under moral realism that we're like tracking what these facts are supposed to be and what they're pertaining to. No, if anything, that's equally explained under a view where, let's say, morality is reducible to valences. Let's just say these like desire traits, right? Like pleasure, pain, things like that. and we're not sort of like invoking some sort of like external extensionality, like some sort of like fact pertaining to some naturalistic hypothesis as to what external natural properties would like ground these moral facts, right? If anything, sure, valences, pain, pleasure, things like that, those are empirically compatible with moral realism. That's not the point. I'm just saying the view where they're reducible down to like a subject's appraisal, right, seems to be more in line with the fact that we've like developed these like naturalistic habits, right? We've developed things that are like certain behaviors that are going to be like socially fit, just given like the context that we're in, right? So those are going to be reducible, at least under the view that, you know, a subjectivist takes valences to be, that there are these like stance dependent facts as to what grounds morality, right? And we don't need to invoke some sort of like additional addendum, right? Some like thesis pertaining to, okay, these facts are both grounded in our cognitive psychology, all the sort of biological facts, and we're appealing to some like strange sort of like naturalistic property out there in the ether that explains this. I don't see why, even given like moral intuitions, like most people wouldn't say, yes, we sort of like developed these behaviors, right, within a social context, just given the fact that we share certain goals. We share the goal of like survival, sort of like cooperation, competition among species, right? We sort of want to like reproduce, like have like generational offspring, things like that. Those all seem perfectly in line with the explanatory thesis that these things are ingrained within a hypothesis that has to deal with like what our emotions are, and not some sort of moral fact out there that's like motivating us, like some fact out there that's external to our minds, or let's say our stances, right? So if it's equally explained under the view that these valences are reducible to stance dependent facts, and we do not need to posit some like external naturalistic property that doesn't add anything significant, at least metaphysically or theoretically, to the hypothesis, then we're justified in like negating moral realism, or in this case, like moral naturalism. Okay. Then there's like a specific part that you said, oh, it seems like you don't even know what predictions are, because I'm giving like some sort of view that these things would be sort of like partially accommodated for, right? So you wanted to say there are these like 10 examples that you want to invoke and say that there's like moral progress, but moral progress isn't equivalent, nor does it make it more likely that there's like empirical progress within the field, right? It could be the case that there's like at least some semblance, like just given what you take progress to be, that just trivially speaking, that there's going to be at least some improvement from like prior standards, right, of morality. But that's not the point. The point is the concept of morality doesn't seem to track anything out there in reality that would make it substantially the case, not just like in terms of minuscule examples that you gave, that we aren't just like semantically jibber jabbering or giving verbal disputes as to what morality pertains to. Take, for example, the field of mereology. If mereological realism is true, we would expect like vast ontic indeterminacy, just given the fact it doesn't seem plausible to posit like real composite objects existing, right, as opposed to some nihilistic hypothesis. If it just happens to be that the nihilistic hypothesis can explain the data equally as well as the realist, but can posit less stuff, both in terms of laws and both in terms of the things that are sort of dependent on for the theory to work, right? So you haven't given a case for how that's going to be true within the moral domain. In the moral domain specifically, it seems like moral realism is going to be theoretically indeterminate. It needs to posit this like vast transparency when it comes to these like moral concepts, which just seems ridiculous on the face of it if you consider the fact that like most people, even if they have the intuition that Jeffrey Dahmer is incorrect for strangling and raping children, it wouldn't imply nor make it more likely that he would be unjustified, right? Just given that criteria alone. Of course, we would have to examine the concept further. And given the fact that we just have like vast disagreement upon what those concepts entail, This means that we have to revise our concepts massively and constantly, right? There hasn't been a single domain within the domains I provided in this conversation, including the mathematical domain, where there is vast conceptual revision that would make it more likely that the concepts that are being used within that domain are transparent. Because it seems like what you want to say is, well, vast disagreement doesn't make it more likely that these concepts are opaque. But just given the fact that like mathematics is constantly being revised, right? We have these like physical theories that are constantly being revised, but yet those views offer more theoretic and empirical progress than anything that's ever been produced by metaethics. It seems to be the case that yes, my view is going to be warranted in positing that these facts are actually opaque. And it doesn't rule out the fact that yes, we have like different evolutionary accounts as to what would explain this, right? Some people are just hardwired in a specific way where their cognitive psychology is, in principle, going to be more malicious. Maybe they have like some sort of trauma in their occipital frontal lobe cortex, right, in comparison to most people, right? And that sort of explains why they have these like psychopathic tendencies. Those are all explained by the neurobiological facts. I can appeal to those things alone and the communitarian standards without appealing to some third ontic or theoretic type by positing something out there in the ether or something external to that to account for those basic facts. The same thing is true when it comes to things like mathematical parsimony or just things pertaining to like mathematical theorems, right? So, for example, you made a huge blunder earlier when you said, "Oh, Arianus, you underdeveloped ape." Uh, Mathematical realists, they don't need to posit a community-related fact in order to say that these mathematical facts are like external or they're like independent of an agent's stances. But the thing is, if they deny the community, right, within their theoretic type, how are they going to explain the laws, right? The laws, if anything, most realists are going to agree, yes, the laws are going to be grounded by the convention, but their ontic scheme is going to be dependent on some like external mathematical facts or properties, right? So you didn't track that point. And it seems like any realist would have to do the same thing within the domain of morality. Yes, they're going to have to posit the community. Yes, they're going to have to posit conventional standards of these semantics, because if they didn't, most people wouldn't even know what the fuck they're talking about, right? When they say that something is immoral. So, of course, you fucking dumbass retard with the sub 40 IQ, yes, they're going to have to posit the community. But the point is, when they sort of deploy that within their ontic scheme, they aren't like explaining something that's necessary to explain the data. It's unnecessary. So I basically just accounted for everything. And then we can move on to like the second part of like my argument, which I think is like more interesting than this because we've been going on for this for like more than an hour.
Yeah, so just to address the 144p quality arguments that this guy just referenced, he talks about the idea of, it being the case that valences, pain, pleasure, and so forth, the reducibility of the moral facts to valences, pain, or pleasure is going to be the type of thing which would serve as some evidence for moral subjectivism or the type of realism he's supporting in this debate, which really and truly is not true. Of course, he said afterwards that valences, pain, or pleasure is compatible with moral realism. However, he's specifically talking about the reductionist intent from the moral subjectivist or the moral anti-realist position to these things. Even if a moral realist and a moral subjectivist can both agree that the moral facts are reducible to these sort of mental attitudes and properties and still believe that there is in fact some sort of like disagreement about the metaphysical nature of the facts. Insofar as the moral realist can believe that even though the moral language is reducible and the moral facts are also reducible to these sort of like, you could say, mental attitudes, it is still the case that stance independent moral facts exist. And so far as these attitudes, let's say pain and pleasure and these valences, they are objectively favorable. They're either objectively favorable or objectively disfavorable insofar as, like a perfect example is like getting a tattoo, for instance, right? So some more realists would say something like, it is the case that you basically endure some levels of pain to get it to 2, right? Now, if they had the option to get that same to 2, right, accomplish that set goal that they have without enduring that pain, they would prefer that option and they would pick that option definitively over actually picking the option whereas they endure that pain for the sake of the tattoo, for instance. And so that's an example of, or an instance where a moral realist can use to show why the sort of like pain states, the favorability or the disfavorability of these sort of like, you could say, attitudes or the desires or the lack of desire of attaining or obtaining these sort of like valences, those things are objectively grounded. Those things are grounded independently of stances. So the attitudes we have about the pain state itself is not specifically something which is relevant insofar as us picking the option of accomplishing the same goal without feeling pain is something which is grounded in some stance independent fact about the pain itself, not grounded insofar as it is determined based off the attitude we have about the pain itself. And so that's where you get the objectively disfavorability aspect from. Now, you talked about the idea of you having to posit strange naturalistic property. That's not even true. You don't have to posit strange naturalistic property to adopt the idea of reducibility of the moral facts to these sort of like mental states, for example, and still believe that there are stance independent facts about these moral properties which would inevitably and fundamentally generate the moral facts which would be stance independent. That's not true. You have not given an argument as to why that has to be the case. Not to mention, you talked about the idea of it being the case that the laws can be explained, the mathematical laws, right? You said, you asked me, how can it be the case that mathematical laws can be explained by or without there being a community, right? Whether or not there is a means by which this, or whether or not I can explicate as to how that could be explained without there being a community does not serve as evidence as to why it has to be the case that there has to be a community for the mathematical laws to be explained. And so if it is the case that it is logically possible, which it is logically possible for mathematical realism to be true without postulating the mathematical community, which analyzes the mathematical data, then it is the case that you don't have to posit this for mathematical realism to explain the data, which is the case. However, on the contrary, for mathematical constructivism to be true, given the definition of constructivism and mathematical constructivism, conventionally speaking, you have to posit by definition a community which would explain the mathematical data respectively. So it's not the same case insofar for mathematical constructivism. We know that it has to be the case of the posit the community, whereas that would not be true for the case of mathematical realism. And make a whole bunch of, unsubstantiated claims. You've just been pontificated really about the idea of there being ontic indeterminacy in the case of mere logical realism, as well as in the case of moral realism, without giving any sort of independent reasons for this. In the case of mere logical realism, you just merely made the claim that the mere logical analysis would be making less sort of pauses, which I don't even grant, by the way, because I could make the argument that if we're going to be talking about pauses in the theoretical type sense, you can make the argument that the mere logical realism would be posited in less theoretical types as it pertains to the theoretical type of mere logical simples, whereas the mere logical analyst, granting that they agree or they grant all the relevant empirical data, will be postulating more theoretical simples or more mere logical simples than the mere logical realist view. So it goes both ways, really. So that would be a sufficient undercutter. Not to mention, you talk about queerness and strangeness. Those things need a lot of clarification. You're just using these vague weasel words to get your way out of the fact that you actually don't have any evidence for whatever you're saying, and you're just skid-rambling your way through this. With that being said, the things that you appeal to for the sake of establishing conceptual opacity, for the sake of demonstrating as to why your concept would not be incoherent, by your concept, just to remind everyone, including you, of what we're talking about here, since I know you have a goldfish brain, we're talking about normative justification, your concept of normative justification. I'm saying that as it relates to that specifically, right, your concept, for that to be something which is coherent, it would have to be the case that you show a preponderance of probabilistic reasons as to why this specific thing was shared by the conventional linguistic practices, which you have not done, by the way, whereas I've shown reasons as to why it is more likely as to why this would not be true given the expectation of the intuitions that people have about the Jeffrey Dahmer case, alongside the inductive case that we both shook hands on and signed off on regarding majority of concepts being linguistically employed in conversations, being the types of things which are in fact transparent epistemically speaking. So the reasons you've given on the latter or on the contrary got undercutted because I've given things which equally expects that data which is compatible with more realism. Plus, I've given independent reasons outside of those undercutted reasons which favors more realism and sorry, not more realism, but rather it favors the idea that your concept of normative justification is incoherent over your presupposition, which is that it would in fact be coherent. So I don't think there's anything else that needs to be addressed here unless you have some new points to bring onto the table, but you can give your response now.
Okay, so when you say that the valence facts are going to be like at least reducible to like some facts about pertaining to an agent's favorability insofar as like they prefer some behaviors that like induce pleasure or pain, like are you specifically when you say grounding there, are you talking about like metaphysical explanation?
In some sense, yeah, I'm like saying the truth makers of the
Okay.
facts related to valence. Just to clarify, before you continue, I'm just saying the facts related to the truth makers of the facts related to valences, pain, pleasure, and so forth, and displeasure. Those things are objective. They're stance independent. It's not based off like what your stances are like of the agents.
Okay. So when you sort of like invoke that there's some sort of favorability relation, is that symmetrically grounded by the stance independent facts or asymmetrically grounded by the stance independent facts?
I'm agnostic on the type of relation insofar as the grounding is concerned, but what I can in fact tell you is that it is the case that these things are metaphysically explained, or you can. I'm not even. This is not even my kind of realism, by the way. This is
Okay.
kind of like minimal realism, and as we both know, there are debates in the field of philosophy regarding whether minimal realism and more subjectivism collapses into each other. But this version of realism basically would just explain these sort of facts about valences by saying, "Hey, we have these facts, and the subject or the predicates of these facts are relating to valences. However, we have stance independent reasons about these facts insofar as doing this action or not doing this action, which is accompanied by these sort of valences or not accompanied by these negative valences."
Okay, so yeah, so then if that's the case, I don't see any symmetry breaker between like you, for example, and like an appraiser relativist, which is my position, where basically we're just determining whether or not these like facts pertaining to like favorability relations are dependent on specifically the cognitive psychology that we've sort of adapted and evolved to. But the reasons in question as to why like we favor one over the other isn't going to be entirely reducible to like what our opinions are, right? That's consistent with appraiser relativism because if you tell someone specifically, okay, this action, right, induces or like causes a negative valence, right, they're going to interpret that as it's going to cause me a negative appraisal of such action. And under those views, it's going to be asymmetrically grounded by the fact that they just have a particular stance, right? That makes it so that they don't take that course of action, and that action is going to be immoral, right?
I
I
think we're
take it
making
that like
progress
if
here.
you're wait,
Mm-hmm.
hold on, I didn't interrupt you, right? You go on like
That's fine.
6 minute monologues, and I have to shut up, right? So like I should be able to respond and given like
Okay,
equal
go for it.
airtime. Okay. If I say, okay, when these facts are in consideration, these facts about valences are going to be dependent on some sort of favorability relation given like a particular subject's like appraisal or disappraisal or pleasure or pain or whatever sort of like dichotomy you want to draw there, right? There's not going to be any sort of like inconsistency with the relativist position, which just reduces all those things down to just mere stances. Now, the part that you want to say is, well, no, still we have like stance independent reasons as to why we should favor one over the other. Yeah, but that's not barring a relativist as well from holding to that position. In fact, it reinforces their position because they want to say there are these like stance independent epistemic reasons as to why we would be motivated in believing that one is more favorable than the other. It's just morally speaking, there are no such stance independent reasons because we just take all those to be reducible to stances, right? If you think you're a minimal realist, right, and there's not going to be any sort of like ontically committing facts, right, specifically about what makes something moral or immoral, right? It's all just going to be grounded by analytic truths or by these sort of like valences. Yeah, I don't see any symmetry breaker between that and like an appraiser relativist just saying, yes, the moral facts, the stance independent moral facts, there are no coextensional facts pertaining to those. There's no coextensionality to those facts, right? So they're either deflated in some analytic sense or they're just reducible to some valence type, which is just consistent with appraiser relativism. The whole point of appraiser relativism is the moral appraisal or disappraisal of an action serves as the truth maker as to whether or not such a thing is considered to be moral or immoral. The reasons could be, I don't know, determined by some stance independent factors, but we're not talking about the reasons specifically. We're talking about the facts. As long as you agree that the facts in question are asymmetrically grounded by some sort of relation pertaining to stance dependent factors like, opinions and, whether or not someone favors or prefers an action that favors like their pleasure over their pain and contrast, then yeah, that's like reducible to some sort of like relativism. I see no substantive difference between your position and basically someone who says, yes, there are no like ontically committing facts pertaining to like these moral truths, but nevertheless, the favorability relations are going to be reducible down to like these sort of like valences that we're evolved to having. And those valences are all going to be grounded by stance dependent facts under a relativist position.
I'm going to ask you a series of questions. So just to be clear, do you think it is the case that for moral facts to exist, right, for them to be an actual existent feature of the world, it has to be the case that in said world, stances and minds have to exist?
For a moral proposition to be stance independently true?
No, for a moral, just given
Just
any
a
moral
moral proposition
proposition,
being true
which is
simplicity,
true.
that's what you're asking.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I could give a semantic argument. I can argue it seems meaningless to posit such facts just absent of like agents or desires or motivations.
Well,
So
I'm
I
not
would
talking
say
about whether or
yes.
not it's meaningless, because like given one's account of meaninglessness, it could be the case that it's meaningless. But I'm asking you, do you think it is the case that for there to be a moral fact implicator, it has to be the case that stances and minds exist for that moral fact to be a fact about the world?
Yeah, I'm saying it's like ingrained within my concept. Like I couldn't make sense of like the relevant facts pertaining to like morality if they were to exist being like independent of like stances or like some sort of like desires or valences of that sort.
So what if someone makes a conditional sentence where the antecedent is false about morality? So for example, if I
About
say that,
okay.
I'll give like an example. So if I say, for instance, if it is the case, let's say the actual world is just, let's say the status quo of the actual world, which is this world, is that humans are completely extinct. Like AI took over, for example, this complete human extinction. There's no moral agents which exist again. Like moral agents are completely dead. Like there are no more moral agents, right? And let's say I was to make a claim, right? There's a proposition out there which states that if it is the case that there are male humans and female humans that exist, then it is immoral for male humans to rape female humans. Would that be a true moral proposition or a false moral proposition?
Then there's like no human minds like within this world. There's like no
Yeah, there are no moral.
valences, no
Because
humans.
before you even answer the question, what it seems to be the case, it seems to be the case that if you say to remain consistent with your position, you'd have to say that it is false, or rather, it is not true. Depends on if you're operating under a binary logic system or a three-value logic system. You'd have to at least say it is not true to make that claim, considering that there are no humans, there are no minds which exist, which would bear as the truth makers for moral propositions. Or you'd have to say that it is true, that it would be immoral, irrespective of the non-existence of these minds and stances, And
Yeah,
so
then
you're in the
that's to
double bind
affirm
here.
realism. Yeah, but then that's to affirm like a sort of realism. Yeah, I understand. I would
Okay,
say,
so what's your
yeah, so I would say no, it wouldn't be true, and that's just because I've sort of like designated the truth makers counterfactually within the context of like there needs to be a world where there at least are some like human minds in order to make sense of those like moral sentences or moral propositions.
So basically, what your position reduces down to, and I'm pretty sure you'd agree that this is very unintuitive, by the way. Your position reduces down to you saying that, hey, if there was to be a world where there, like, let's say, for example, let's say there's another set of species identical to human beings, but there's like one specific fact which prevents them from being classified under the biological taxonomy of a human being, right? It seems that under your view, you would say that if there were to be a set of species that looks just like human beings, have the same neurological facts as human beings, and have everything with the exception of one relevant physical fact, which makes them being considered under different species as a human being, there's nothing wrong with the male species of that specific category to rape the female species, right? You would say that there's nothing
Are
wrong
you
with that
saying
under
like
your
it
view.
would be unintuitive to like posit some like error theory pertaining to like what the moral classifications would be in such a world where there's just AI and the AI is sort of like closely a replica to like human sentience, but there's like one relevant physical fact that distinguishes them? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and by the way, they have quality. They have qualitative experiences. So I wouldn't
So they
say
have
AI, but
qualia
like,
and they're kind of like
mhm.
us, but there's like one relevant physical fact that like distinguishes them.
Yeah, so under
I
your
would
view, you'd have to say
say
that there's nothing wrong with the male AGI, for example, raping the female AGI. There's nothing wrong with that, despite the female AGI experiencing pain and displeasure from the action. There's nothing wrong with that action. Like you'd have
yeah,
to
but
say
I'm
that.
saying like it seems like under that position, it's going to be equally explained under some like view where yes, symmetrically speaking, we are talking about stances, and we can sort of abrogate moral language and just specifically talk about like the desires that people have in that world, even if there are like no human agents involved, right? So like, I don't think okay, just given the fact that like saying it's wrong, right, simplicator means that it's going to be unintuitive. If all you mean by wrong is like, I don't think there's going to be like some stance independent truth that makes such a statement like true, right? Like it's wrong to like rape someone. I don't think that's
We
like
can basically
unintuitive.
postpone the
I
semantical
don't think
analysis
it's
for later
unintuitive.
on. Okay, so I mean,
Yeah, I
it's
wanted
just
to
an intuition
clarify
proof argument.
something. I
Yeah,
wanted to, can I
go
clarify
for it.
something before you go?
Go.
Okay, so here's my point. I don't think if you smuggle in some like stance independent normativity, yes, like most people are going to say yes, it's like intuitively wrong to say that, but I'm not doing that. I'm supposing that yes, we can sort of like abrogate the way that people sort of like devise, because with that AGI example, we aren't even using like human beings, right, that have like full on like replicas of consciousness, right, or things like that. There's at least like one relevant physical difference that distinguishes us from them. Seems like most people are going to want to make these claims in mind that they're talking about like human beings, right? And they're not supposing this like counterfactual analysis as to like what would make such an action wrong in a given world absent like human minds. I think when people make these sort of claims, they have human minds like in consideration, right? And they also, it doesn't seem like it's going to be unintuitive given the semantics I provided, because if anything, under like the view that you gave of valence, it's just going to be vacuously grounded by whatever happens to be the sort of favorability relations that make one action induce pleasure and the other one action inducing pain. Like, if anything, the view that the relativist is providing is saying, no, the favorability relation is not dependent solely upon the base example, right? The base example basically informs us, right? The fact that we've evolved to have these desires, it doesn't mean that we're like tracking some like stance independent moral fact, right, out there in the ether. It's just saying we have these desires, and the way that we carry on with our lives is going to be dependent strictly upon like which actions are going to guide like our behaviors. And some actions are going to induce pleasure, which is a good, and other actions are going to induce pain, which is bad, right? And then we determine moral sentences based off of that. So yeah, again, I don't see any symmetry breaker between this position, which you're just basically like reducing it down like to some sort of like subjective favorability relation, with like an appraiser relativist position, which is anti-realist in nature, and it basically just designates all those moral truths as just being stance dependent, right? And we
Yeah,
can
so just a
like
couple of
conclude. We can conclude here if you want to add something.
Yeah, just to clear up something, you talked about the human mind stuff. You don't think they have human minds in their consideration and they're making these sort of like moral analyses. I don't agree with that. Like, I think, for example, pretty obviously, if let's say Marvel was to, let's say, have a new movie, for instance, right? And in this new movie, you could say, I don't know, freaking, well, let's say DC had a new movie, for instance, right? And in this new movie, right, fucking like Superwoman, for example, who we know is not a human being, she's like an actual alien, which everyone knows. Like, let's say she was to like get like raped by like some fucking like villain in that specific verse, right? Now, the average audience who watches that movie, if you ask the average audience, was it okay for that character to rape Superwoman despite she not being a human being or being a part of the human species? They would say, yes, that was just disgusting, that was fucked up, that was wrong, that was just weird, right? I don't think the human species thing is necessarily relevant. And in the hypothetical I'm stipulating, there is some sense of epistemic indiscernibility between the AIs we're talking about and human beings. Insofar as, given what we know and given what we would ever know about these specific AIs, they would basically be the exact same as a human being, even though there's actually a secret metaphysical fact which makes them distinct and makes them something which is not a part of the taxonomy of the Homo sapien species. They are epistemically indiscernible from human beings. And so, given that specific criteria, it would definitely be the case that the average person would say this is definitely wrong. But I don't want to, hinge my argument on the intuition pump part. That was just for the optics to make it show or to show why it is the case that your position is intuitively ridiculous.
Yeah, but
The
not
actual argument,
substantively. Yeah, so
the
it's
actual
not like a
argument
substantive, not
it,
like a
it, it kind of
substantive
is it
critique
kind
of
of
a
is substantive
position.
because if it kind of is substantive considering that people do in fact share the intuitions I'm talking about, right? Which is evidence
No, they
against your
don't.
position. But even
They,
though, yeah, if you think that the
yeah,
average
just bar
person
that by the
would think that there's
objection that I
something, hold
gave.
on, if
That
you think the
you
average
admittedly
person,
had no
if you
substantive
think the average
response to.
person, if you think the average person would see nothing wrong in Superwoman getting raped by a tentacle monster, then you're a weirdo. But look, besides that, right?
A
About the other
weirdo,
part
but a
we're talking
weirdo
about.
insofar as
But
like
besides
I'm
the
sort of
other part
inducing
we're going to be
pain
talking
onto
about,
them. It just seems
look
like
at
you're
you
making like
just
some sort of like
spazzing
objection
out.
from this.
Wow, I thought you were
You're making
complaining
some
about this
objection
stuff.
from
What's
disgust. You're
going
saying,
on?
okay,
What's
it's
going on?
weird, so therefore what?
It's weird that you're interrupting the person while begging for an objection. Just relax,
Okay,
champ.
so what do you
So what I'm
think
trying
is
to say
meant
here is
there by
calm down,
weird? If
G.
it's not like some sort
Calm
of
down,
semblance
G.
of disgust,
And
then
now he's gonna meta debate me on the weirdness word because he's trying to deal with the
yeah,
topic.
but isn't
Now
that
let
what
me
you
go on.
tried to do earlier when you
Typical
said you're
behavioral
invoking like
behavior.
strange
When
naturalistic
you're just going
properties? You're
off,
invoking the word strange.
just going off.
Okay, this in itself is
While I'm
strange. Like,
unfazed
what
by
do
you
you
derailing
consider
the
weird
topic.
about that?
Just watch Arianus as he proceeds
And
to
what do
talk
you
over
consider?
Apollo,
So,
as he
look,
gets
Apollo, do you
increasingly
think that they're look, you fucking
intimidated.
brain dead Jamaican, you coconut
And now
gravity
he's
Jamaican?
resorting
Do
to
you
the ad
think
homs because he
that
can't
there is
actually tell what's
some
going on.
stance independent fact that's
He's
derived,
just
morally
proving
speaking,
more and
from
more
that action
that
being
he's an
quote unquote weird? Yes or
underdeveloped
no?
ape. Just look at him talk over me. God damn it. You're
I'm
peeing your
talking over
underwears
you
right
because
now.
I just want you to
You're
clarify a
peeing
few
your
things.
underwears. Okay,
Do you
just calm
think
down.
something being weird indicates that there is some
Okay,
stance
Ariana.
independent moral
Okay,
fact?
okay. Let's get back to this. So my argument against your position was not just the unintuitive nature of that specifically, which I've successfully established while you attempted to speak over me to get into rhetorical gambit. I've mentioned the cases against your position. You
That's cute.
attempted to undercut it if you attempted to give as it relates to the prediction, so reduced to build its surveillances. Never worked either. So it's kind of like terrible, on your end, to be honest. It has been terrible from the beginning on your end, but then at a level where there's no way you can come back from this, type shit. But just moving on from this little like optical thing right now. Just focus on something more important, right? If you want to talk about the appraisal relativist position, right? And if you're saying that your position collapses into moral realism insofar as your grandson that there would be stance-independent
Moral
facts as it relates to
anti-realism.
moral properties, which would make it the case that there would be stance-independent moral facts,
I said it
then for
collapses into
one, that
moral
would be
anti-realism.
pipe down, G. That would be an automatic concession, right? But not to mention, if you're not going to be making that claim, right, and you're going to be adopting the position that you're rejecting stance-independent reasons. All it takes stance-independent reasons to be are stance-independent normative facts about ethics, and I take normative facts to be a subset of descriptive facts. It is descriptive facts about a different domain, which is ethics. So I think that it is the case that you have not shown any sufficient distinction between your view and my view insofar as moral realism is concerned, and I've given the inductive evidence which demonstrates that your position about the linguistic conventional practices of moral agents would be something which is incoherent because it does not conform with these conventional practices. Right. So we have all of those things laid out. I mean, you are basically trying to push conclusions, knowing that you're getting BTFO, then that's fine. I mean, look, if you want to go to conclusions right now, we can, and we can go on to a different part of the argument. Although my point is at 8% right now, we can see how much we can cover and basically go from there.
Okay, so first to clarify, when you say that person would be a weirdo, what do you think is being indicated there? Do you think that like some stance-independent normativity is being indicated by the fact they would be a weirdo if they thought it wasn't wrong?
I don't think there has to be any sort of like stance independent / stance dependent accounts of normativity which has to be invoked for that to be true. I'm just saying the fact of that being true would be evidence against your position, which entails the proposition that these things are necessary determinants of the moral facts.
Wait, so how is it evidence? Like the whole point is like the weirdness specifically within the domain of like conventional semantics. When someone says, okay, yes, this person is like acting in a way that's inappropriate, right? Just given the fact that we understand certain things to be immoral, right? Do you think that they're going to be invoking some like fact about moral realism or some fact pertaining to like stance independent normativity? Because it seems like when most people say, yeah, that guy is weird or he acts in a weird way, they're most likely just talking about their like emotive attitudes or their like emotions or their level of disgust at the action, which is better explained by an anti-realist position than a realist position.
Wait, hold on a second. So you think it's just a probabilistic case? You think it is most likely an expression of emotive states? So just to be clear, that's going to be an
On
implicit
the
concession of this
semantics of
possibility.
the term that's being
Wait,
used,
wait,
yes.
hold on, wait on. You kind of just like messed yourself up, right? Because now the original theory is logically
Yeah,
possible
please
for
tell me
more
why.
real, but now, hold on, you say this. But now you're saying that it is the case that there is in
What?
fact, or there
No,
does in
look, I'm
fact remain the
saying,
possibility.
given the
No, don't talk.
term that was being
Don't talk
used in
over
this
me now.
context
Oh, look at
being
him just
called
crying.
weird, I'm
Look, you
saying
can throw your
there
baby temper
hasn't been
tantrum when I'm
any
done talking.
demonstrable
Okay?
probabilistic
Look at him
evidence that
talking
would
over me.
point
This
to
is
some
so scary.
fact
This is
of
so
like
crazy.
moral realism being
Why are you
true.
so scared, dude? Okay, so
I'm
I'm gonna
not
continue
scared,
my
I'm
point.
just
Okay, you're
clarifying the
scared of me
point. I'm
pointing
saying,
out.
look,
You're scared of me
you made a
pointing out the
retarded point
trash
by saying, yes, this
contradiction
is going to be
that you
vastly
committed
unintuitive
yourself to.
because this
Wait,
is
just
considered
to be clear on
weird.
something,
And I said,
you
what part of
said
you saying that
originally.
it's weird can't
Hey,
be
calm
explained under
down,
some fact
relax,
that's going to be stance
calm
dependent
down, Jay. I'm
or
still
something
talking,
dependent on like
and he's
moral
still going.
anti-realism being true,
And he's
dumbass?
still
So
going.
look,
Oh my
retard,
God, he's still
look,
going.
dumbass.
And now he's saying the dumbass insult. Oh, he's
Yeah,
learning
you
from
did
his
say
dad
something
T-Jump.
dumb
Oh
because
shit.
you were basically
You're
saying,
learning from
look,
your dad
the
T-Jump.
intuition
Anyways,
prompt, which wasn't
moving
at all
on. You're
substantive, by
crashing
the
out,
way,
dude. You're
presented
crashing
no
out.
undercutting or rebutting
You're
defeater for the
manifesting.
position. It was
You're
just used for some like
manifesting.
shitty
You're
rhetorical
talking over
device,
me
right?
right now because
You
you're so
said
scared.
you
You're
said that it was
complaining,
weird. Then I said,
Ariana. What's
what?
going on? See, because you're complaining about interruptions and I had to go on mute when you're talking, since you don't have the level of self-control like an actual human being to mute yourself and shut the fuck up like a good bitch, I'm gonna mute yourself. I'm gonna mute your account for you. Okay. So, as I was saying, the contradiction. And by the way, if you want to talk about perma just to be clear, when I unmute you after this, I'm going to mute myself and I'm not going to interrupt you not even once to demonstrate equity and fairness. So the contradiction is You said originally that moral realism is incoherent. That's your position. And you gave two criteria for this claim. You said the first criteria was you making the claim that it is incoherent on the basis of a type of thing is inconsistent with classical logic. So for something to be coherent, it either has to be the case that it is consistent with classical logic principles, or it is something which does not share any conformity, any conceptual conformity with conventional linguistic practices. Now, just a moment ago, before you started to spaz the fuck out after realizing you're getting blown the fuck out, you said that it is most likely the case that things that people are referring to, by the way, are the types of things which are emotive expressions. And so you're conceding to the possibility of them referring to, you could say, extramental facts, facts that are not based off stances or minds. So that would be a possibility, a concession to a possibility claim, which would result in moral realism being coherent, which is incompatible with your position. So if you're going to make that claim, right, first and foremost, that's going to require a successful probabilistic argument, which you have yet to give through at any moment, at any time, at any part of the situation. And also, just you appeal into a probabilistic argument fucks over your own position, because your position concedes or commits you to making the claim that it is logically impossible for realism to be true. So, give that and the other criteria you mentioned, there will be incompatibility. Now you can ape the fuck out, moron. Go for it. You have my speed permission now.
Okay, dumb fuck. The whole point of me bringing up the probabilistic stuff was to point out, given the fact that you think it is logically possible, given the fact that you think that moral realism is coherent, let's actually examine by Apollo's standards, not by Arianus's standards, retard, whether or not the proposition in question is probability raising, right? So the proposition in question is, it is weird, right, for X agent to rape Y in this world where there is no human minds and there's just AI that replicates human consciousness and qualia. Then I said, well, what do you think the probability raising mechanism is for that thing being more likely the case that it's explained under moral realism than anti-realism? And then I specifically said, it seems like when people invoke the semantics for this stuff, when they say Endless is weird for using Korean girls as his PFP, right? And he's not acting normally, we're invoking some emotive standard or some standard relating to disgust or just disappraisal of the action in question, right? That's at least how I'm interpreting it. So I never once contradicted myself. It would only be the case that I contradicted myself, you brain dead Jamaican monkey, is if I said, yes, I'm both taking it the case that I'm using a probabilistic argument against moral realism, and it's not the case I'm using a probabilistic argument against moral realism. I'm using a case of logical necessity, you dumbass, right? So deal with the internal critique I offered you. Is it the case, given your standards of probability, that if something is being invoked as weird, right, the concept of weird is being deployed, that they're most likely talking about some feature that tracks some sort of stance independent normative fact rather than their desires or their emotive attitudes? Go ahead. Because there's no contradiction,
So
and you
maybe if you're
provided no
spending more
undercutting or
time to
rebutting
listen,
defeater for there
yeah,
being a contradiction within my
yeah, you can
position.
calm down now. Yeah, it's Daddy's turn to talk. Just shut the fuck up for him. Okay. So what I was just gonna say, by the way, very
Dad,
just
but
simply,
younger than me
as
by
it
6
relates, and
years.
he's talking
Crazy.
over me again. The ape just does not have any self-control today. Notice, so I muted myself the entire time when he was okay. So now maybe if it's more track what I'm saying, instead of just talking ape and you keep immigrant ape, you'd honor fact just simply that if you're gonna say that these are necessary, right, for these things being the stances of human beings being necessary for there to be moral facts. If we have a case scenario where there's a fact about a possible world in which that possible world is non-inclusive of mental states or mental stances, then clearly it would be the case that that would be incompatible with your position, because you think it is necessary for these things to exist, for there to be moral facts. but there would be a moral fact about this world which is not inclusive of any of these properties or things. So with that being said, you have no sort of understanding of what's going on here. You have no sort of understanding or comprehension of the very mere obvious fact, which you have yet to even understand the entire time, that you cannot say on one hand that these sort of mental stuff is necessary or are necessary for there to be moral facts, but then agree that people have the intuitions, which would be evidence, by the way, trivially, for it being the case that you have worlds where there are facts about these worlds according or about ethics, which would not be inclusive of the very same thing you believe to be necessary for those same facts. Right? Now, if you want to say, for example, that it is more likely that by awareness they're talking about some sort of emotive states or whatever, it depends on the type of awareness. You dishonest scumbag. You know, when you're talking about someone being weird for having Korean girl PFPs, they're not making the moral claim. They're not saying, hey, you should not do this. They're just saying, hey, this thing is kind of like a bit repulsive, right? You're basically equivocating on conventional awareness. Like, for example, it's weird to simp for females like Dua Lipa, for example. It's being weird to rape babies. There's this right there. You can't even compare the two types of awareness. One is obviously more severe and has a much larger impact on our belief system and our action guiding principles than the other. So what you're talking there is just a dishonest equivocation for the sake of running away from the dumb claim you made previously about the idea of you thinking that there's some level of compatibility. And once again, outside of this intuition pump that I've used against your position, which makes your position look like complete horseshit, right? Outside of that, the evidence I presented previously has yet to be addressed. The inductive evidence, again, against the position, the points regarding the vast majority of concepts being transparent, and how I undercutted every single one of your trash dog water responses to what my argument was, right? All of these things would serve as evidence against the position that your concept of normative justification is the type of thing which maps onto conventional linguistic practices, which, given your own standard, you moron, would establish sufficiently as to why your concept is just incoherent. It's just nonsensical gobbledygook, which no one should give a fuck about, which everyone should just dismiss and neglect, just like how your parents dismissed you, obviously. So now we're just going to move on from this, if you want to move on, right, to a different point perhaps, or we can just end the debate off from here because your argument fell flat on its head today despite the amount of preparation put into this debate, basically. So that's just it. I'm going to mute you right now. You can talk right now. You can just throw your temper tantrum right now. But please, just don't do it when I'm trying to give an argument. That's just not how debates work. Yeah. Oh, Z finally. That's crazy. Anyways, here you go. Unmuted. Go for it, Abe.
Okay,
Now,
so the whole point about Korean girl PFPs and like someone raping someone, okay, sure, one is going to have more significant impact than the other. That doesn't rule out the point that I'm making. There doesn't seem like any stringent phenomenal difference between the amount of disgust that's like leveled on, and specifically to like Korean girl PFPs being used, to like some like action being like, I don't know, coercive or things like that. They're both going to be the case, just given the semantics that people are using. And you agreed to this, by the way, that they are going to invoke some level of disgust, right? I just take that phenomenal concept, right, to be relating to specifically stance dependent considerations or facts pertaining to an agent's psychology. Okay, so the amount part or the severity part doesn't rule out the part that, yes, what's phenomenally grounding the fact that this is weird, just given their use of the semantics, is going to be dependent on an emotion. Okay. Then you went on like a long diatribe about like, oh, this is just like evidence that you're like contradicting yourself. No, I just said specifically, we're granting the possibility for the sake of argument that yes, there is such a world where there are these like AGIs, and these AGIs have a replica of human consciousness, and they have qualia. But it's not going to be true that just given the semantics of weirdness alone, or some fact pertaining to like why they shouldn't rape, that tracks some like stance independent normative fact. You also didn't track that point, right? And then when I clarified and said, yes, specifically, we're talking about your standards, right? We're talking about the standards relating to like what you think it's going to be probability raising for the hypothesis. You never gave any argument like specifying why there's a lack of grounding insofar as like when we say something is weird, that's going to be dependent on the fact that they are like invoking some like non-emotive standard or like some externalist standard, right? So the point that you said was complete dog shit, to put it in your words. And then the final point was, okay, this is just going to undermine the position entirely, because you're saying it's both the case that your like conventional semantical view is true, and it's not the case, right? Never said it wasn't the case that my view wasn't the case, right? I said specifically there's a probabilistic argument that's been laid on the table given Apollo standards. He's granting the possibility of moral realism being true. Let's examine that. So what is going to like raise the probability that if something morally unintuitive, let's grant, in that world occurs, that is tracking some like stance independent fact of normativity? You gave no response to that. The whole point about wanting to reduce these valences, right, to facts about psychology and things like that, that's going to be no different than from a relativist, which just treats those facts as being dependent on some sort of like favorability relation on what their desires are, right? So if an agent desires ice cream over, let's say, I don't know, eating like Godiva chocolate, right? Or they prefer to go to a concert instead of going to like a lecture, or they prefer to have consensual sex over like raping someone, things like that. Those are all going to be dependent on specifically what the agent is categorizing those facts as being pertaining to their desires. There's not going to be any sort of like stance independent reason that governs or grounds why they choose something to begin with, or what motivates them to choose, right? That's just like completely what your part is. What you're doing in this debate is basically saying you're not providing any sort of like symmetric difference from like the realists, right, that does take these things to be stance independent. Well, that's just like assuming the thing in contention. I'm saying if you're agreeing that these facts, these stance independent facts, have no coextensionality to them and they're just reducible to valences, I don't see how that's any different from someone who says, yes, the moral facts are not coextensional, they aren't referring to something in the world, and we're just strictly talking about our preferences. That's why I think like all these like minimal realist positions are just going to collapse to like either an appraisal relativist position or like subjectivism, right? And then we can like conclude the debate there.
Yeah, I think I've already addressed the points regarding like the distinction between minimal realism and appraisal relativism. Regarding what you were talking about, you've just been pontificated for the main part. So, I mean, since you proposed conclusions first, you can just give your conclusions first, considering that I started off the debates, and then we can just kick things off from there now.
Well, I said everything I wanted to say. If you wanted to add something, you can do that.
So after I give my conclusions, there's nothing else you have to add to this debate?
No, I just basically said, I just told you. I
Yeah,
just
because
said
I'm not going to be
to
introducing any new arguments. I'm just going
I'll
to be
just
giving a
consider
recap of
everything.
the
Yeah, we can, if you want to do a part two, we can do like that argument later. I'm just saying, like, for now, I've said everything I wanted to say.
Okay, got you. So here are my conclusions for the entire debate itself. Well, originally the proposition was on whether moral realism is true or it is not true. Basically, my opponents basically tried to give an argument as to why moral realism is incoherent, which would be evidence according to his perspective what evidence is, as to why it would be a false proposition. He thinks, or rather, given this account of coherency, something is coherent if it is the case that it satisfies one of these two disjuncts. Disjunct number one, it is consistent with classical logic. Disjunct number two, it is the case that it is consistent with conventional linguistic practices. Now, with that being said, I have basically pressed him on the first disjunct. I've asked him, do we believe that moral realism being true is not consistent with classical logic and demonstrates a logical contradiction? He said yes. I asked him for the logical contradiction. He did not actually establish any logical contradiction successfully. He stated that a moral